In the autumn of 1858, New York City was a place of astonishing contradiction. Along Broadway, gas lamps flickered over a rising skyline of brick and brownstone, and the docks of the East River groaned under the weight of a nation's ambition. Steamships bound for Liverpool and Havana crowded the harbor beside creaking clipper ships that still carried the old world's cargo into the new. Fortunes were being built overnight in shipping, banking, and real estate, while a few blocks away, in the tenements of the Five Points, immigrants from Ireland and Germany crowded into rooms with no light and no air, working themselves toward exhaustion for wages that barely kept hunger at bay. It was a city of extremes, a city that had not yet decided what kind of country it belonged to. The United States itself stood on the edge of a reckoning. Slavery still held the South in its grip, and the arguments over its future grew sharper every year, filling newspapers, pulpits, and parlors with a tension that would soon explode into war. Yet on the surface, at least for families of wealth and standing, life carried on with a certain grace. It was into this city, and into one of its most established families, that a sickly, wide-eyed boy was born on the 27th of October, 1858, in a brownstone at 28 East 20th Street. His parents named him Theodore Roosevelt Jr., though for most of his life he would simply be called T.I. by those who loved him. New York in that decade was still finding its footing as a modern metropolis. The horse-drawn omnibus rattled over cobblestones that had not yet given way to asphalt, and the elevated railways that would later come to define the city's skyline were still years away. Politics in the city was already a contact sport, run through ward bosses and patronage networks that traded jobs and favors for votes, a system that respectable families of the Roosevelts standing generally viewed with distaste and kept at arm's length, preferring instead to exercise influence through charitable institutions, churches, and business associations rather than through the grubby machinery of elections. Wealth in New York at that time was not yet the wealth of industrial titans and Wall Street speculators that would come to define the Gilded Age a generation later. It was, for families like the Roosevelts, a quieter, older kind of prosperity, built over generations rather than made overnight, and it came bundled with a strong, almost obligatory sense of civic duty. This was the world, both its comforts and its unspoken expectations, that Theodore Roosevelt was born into. The Roosevelts were already old New York by the time of his birth. His father's side of the family traced back to a Dutch farmer named Claes Martin Zin van Rosenvelt, who had crossed the Atlantic in the 1640s to settle on the marshy edges of Manhattan when it was still New Amsterdam. Over the generations that followed, the Roosevelts had built a name for themselves not through flamboyance, but through steady accumulation, in glass importing, banking, and real estate, until by the middle of the 19th century, they were comfortably counted among the city's elite. Theodore's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a man widely admired for both his wealth and his conscience. He was a partner in the family's plate glass importing business, but he was equally known for his tireless work in charity, helping to found institutions such as the Children's Aid Society, the Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was a broad-shouldered, energetic man, deeply religious in a practical rather than showy way, who believed that privilege carried with it an obligation to serve others. His son would later call him simply the best man I ever knew, a judgment he never revised. Theodore's mother, Martha Bullock, known to everyone as Mitty, came from an entirely different world. She had grown up on a grand plantation near Roswell, Georgia, the daughter of a family whose wealth and identity were bound up in the institution of slavery and the customs of the antebellum South. She was famous for her beauty, her charm, and a certain delicate constitution that kept her often confined to bed with vague ailments the doctors of the day struggled to name. The marriage of a northern businessman with reforming instincts to a southern belle from a slaveholding family was, in its own way, a small reflection of the larger union that was about to be tested by war. Mitty brought to the household in New York a warmth, a theatrical sense of storytelling, and a set of divided loyalties that would soon place unbearable strain on the family, since two of her own brothers would go on to serve in the Confederate Navy while her husband's sympathies lay firmly with the Union. Theodore was the second of 4 children. His older sister, Anna, whom the family called Bammy, was a formidable and quick-minded girl who, despite a spinal condition that curved her back and limited her physical activities, would become one of the most influential figures in her younger brother's life, a source of calm intelligence he would rely on for decades. After Theodore came his brother Elliot, a beautiful and charming boy who as a child seemed, if anything, more naturally gifted than Theodore, more athletic and more socially at ease, though his life would take a far darker turn in later years. The youngest, Corinne, was closest to Theodore in temperament, sharing his love of books and his emotional intensity, and the two remained close confidants throughout their lives. The household they grew up in was, by the standards of the era, a happy one, filled with reading aloud in the evenings, boisterous games, natural history specimens scattered across tabletops, and a governess-supervised schoolroom on the top floor of the East 20th Street house. It was a home of comfort and love, but from Theodore's earliest years, comfort could not protect him from the affliction that would define his childhood more than any other single fact: his asthma. The attacks came suddenly and without warning, often in the middle of the night. A child who moments before had been laughing over a picture book would begin to gasp, his chest tightening as though a hand were closing around his lungs, his lips sometimes turning faintly blue from the effort of trying to draw breath. In the medical understanding of the 1860s, asthma was poorly understood and even more poorly treated. There were no inhalers, no corticosteroids, none of the modern interventions that make the condition manageable today. Physicians of the period tried an array of remedies that ranged from the merely useless to the frankly dangerous, from strong black coffee to induce the airways to open, to cigars that the boy was made to smoke in the belief that the smoke would relax his bronchial passages, to blistering treatments applied directly to the chest. None of it reliably worked. What did seem to help, at least a little, was fresh air, an upright position, and above all, the presence of someone who loved him. Family letters and later recollections described Theodore Sr. carrying his gasping son through the night air on the balcony, or riding with him in an open carriage through the dark streets of New York at 3 in the morning, the horses' hooves echoing off the brownstone facades, in the desperate hope that the cold wind rushing past would force air back into the boy's straining lungs. Mitty, for her part, sat up through countless nights, holding him upright, murmuring comfort, watching for the telltale color returning to his cheeks. These attacks were not occasional inconveniences. They were, by every account, terrifying, both for the boy who endured them and for the parents who could do so little beyond holding him and waiting. Theodore later wrote candidly in his autobiography about how frightening these episodes were, how he came to associate the night with a specific, personal kind of dread, the fear that this time the breath might not come back. A child who spends his early years uncertain whether his own body will fail him in the dark develops, almost inevitably, a particular relationship with fear itself. Some children in such circumstances become withdrawn, cautious, protective of a fragile self. Theodore went the opposite direction. From a very young age, he seemed to decide, consciously or not, that if his body could betray him without warning, then he would spend every waking hour proving to himself that it would not define him. This instinct, planted in the middle of the night in a New York bedroom sometime in the early 1860s, would become the seed of one of the most famous personal transformations in American history. It was his father who gave that instinct its direction. When Theodore was about 12 years old, Theodore Sr. sat him down and delivered advice that his son would remember, nearly word, for the rest of his life. He told the boy that he had the mind but not the body, and that without the body, the mind could not go as far as it should. He said that Theodore must make his body, and that it could be done through work, through discipline, through effort applied daily and without excuse. It was not offered as a scolding but as a challenge, one man of purpose speaking frankly to another, even though one of them was still a child in short trousers. Theodore took the challenge with a seriousness that startled the adults around him. A gymnasium was built on the porch of the family's summer home, and later a proper one was set up in the New York house, complete with horizontal bars, weights, and a punching bag. Theodore began a regimen of boxing, weightlifting, and calisthenics that he pursued with almost religious devotion, day after day, in an effort to reshape a body that had betrayed him for so long. Progress was slow and the asthma did not vanish overnight, or even over years, but something else happened in the process. The boy discovered that willpower applied steadily over time could, in fact, change reality. It was a lesson he would apply to nearly every arena of his life from that point forward, from physical fitness to intellectual achievement to political reform. The philosophy he would later preach to the entire nation as the strenuous life was not an abstract slogan invented for political effect. It was forged, quite literally, in a home gymnasium by a boy trying to outmuscle his own lungs. It is worth pausing on just how uncertain that outcome felt at the time. There was no guarantee, in the 1860s and 1870s, that exercise would do anything at all for a chronic asthmatic. Some physicians of the era actively discouraged strenuous activity for children with weak constitutions, fearing it would overtax a fragile heart or lungs. Theodore's own family worried, more than once, that his punishing self-imposed regimen might do him more harm than good. And there were setbacks along the way, attacks that struck him even in the middle of his training, moments when the discipline program seemed to be accomplishing nothing at all. He kept at it anyway, boxing with instructors who did not go easy on him simply because he wheezed between rounds, lifting weights until his arms shook, riding and rowing and hiking whenever his lungs would allow it. Slowly, unevenly, across years rather than months, his chest broadened, his stamina improved, and the attacks, while they never disappeared entirely from his life, became less frequent and somewhat less severe. He would carry a mild susceptibility to respiratory trouble into adulthood, a fact he rarely advertised, preferring the world to see only the robust, energetic figure he had spent a childhood constructing. But the private knowledge of what that construction had cost him, and what it had proven was possible, never left him, and it shaped his lifelong impatience with anyone, including himself, who accepted weakness as a permanent verdict rather than a starting condition to be overcome. Alongside this physical struggle ran another passion, equally intense, that revealed a different side of young Theodore's character: his consuming love of the natural world. The origin story the family told for years afterward involved a dead seal. When Theodore was about 7 years old, he came across the carcass of a seal laid out on a slab at a Broadway market, and he was transfixed. He returned to see it again and again, measured it as best a child could, and eventually managed to obtain the skull, which became the founding specimen of what he grandly named the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, an institution that in practice consisted of a shifting collection of bird skins, mouse skeletons, insects, turtles, and whatever else a curious and increasingly skilled amateur naturalist could preserve and display in the corner of a New York townhouse, much to the periodic dismay of the household staff, who occasionally had to contend with the smell of imperfectly cured animal skins. Theodore taught himself the rudiments of taxidermy from a book and from a local shop where he purchased supplies. He kept detailed journals of birds he observed, in careful, increasingly confident handwriting, noting species, behavior, and habitat with a rigor well beyond his years. He devoured every natural history book he could find, and though his eyesight was so poor that he had, without realizing it, been missing enormous amounts of visual detail in the natural world until he was finally fitted for spectacles around age 13. Once he could actually see clearly, his observational hunger only intensified. This was not a passing childhood fascination that he would outgrow. The habit of close, disciplined observation of the natural world, and the belief that direct experience mattered more than secondhand description, would remain central to Roosevelt for the rest of his life, shaping everything from his later scientific writing to his conservation policies as president. The discovery of his poor eyesight is itself worth lingering on because it illustrates something important about how Theodore's mind worked even as a child. For years, no one, including Theodore himself, had realized that he was seeing the world through a haze. He had simply assumed that the blurred, indistinct version of trees, birds, and distant landmarks that he perceived was what everyone perceived, and he had adapted his methods of observation accordingly, relying more on sound, on close inspection of objects held near his face, and on patient, repeated looking rather than a single confident glance. When his family finally realized the problem and had him fitted with spectacles, the change was, in his own later description, revelatory, as though a curtain had been pulled back on a world of sharp edges and distant detail he had not known existed. Rather than resenting the years of unnecessary difficulty this had caused him, Theodore treated it as simply one more obstacle that had been identified and corrected, and moved on with characteristic speed to make full use of his newly clear vision. It was a pattern that would recur throughout his life. Encounter a limitation, diagnose it as clearly as possible, apply whatever remedy existed, and then push forward without dwelling on the unfairness of having faced the limitation in the first place. The specimens he collected during these years were not idle trophies. He learned to skin and mount birds with genuine technical skill, corresponded as a teenager with the taxidermists and naturalists of the American Museum of Natural History, an institution his own father had helped found, and by his early teens could identify local bird species by call alone, a skill that impressed even seasoned outdoorsmen many years his senior. Visitors to the Roosevelt home learned to expect, and mostly to tolerate with good humor, the presence of live mice in glass jars, birds' eggs arranged in careful rows, and the occasional overpowering odor of arsenic soap, the preservative Theodore used in his taxidermy work, drifting down the stairs from what the family had come to call, half affectionately and half with resignation, the Roosevelt Museum. Formal education, in the conventional sense, came to Theodore in an unconventional way. Because of his fragile health, he was educated primarily at home by tutors and governesses rather than sent to school with other boys his age, and this private, somewhat improvised schooling, supplemented by his own relentless independent reading, gave him an unusual intellectual formation, wide-ranging, self-directed, occasionally uneven in its foundations, but driven by a genuine hunger to know things. His family also traveled extensively, including 2 lengthy tours of Europe and the Middle East during his boyhood, journeys that exposed him to ancient ruins, foreign languages, ships, deserts, and cultures far removed from Manhattan, even as his asthma continued to plague him in unfamiliar climates and circumstances. By the time he was ready for college, the physical transformation he had pursued so doggedly had begun to show real results. He was not a large man, and would never be, but he had become wiry, strong, and full of an almost restless physical energy that had been entirely absent in the gasping child of a decade before. Before Harvard, there was the wider country to consider, and the peculiar moment in its history into which Theodore was coming of age. He had been not quite 3 years old when the Civil War ended, too young to remember it, but he grew up entirely within its long shadow. The war had settled the question of the Union's survival and had ended slavery, but it had left behind a nation exhausted, bitterly divided along regional lines, and uncertain how to rebuild itself. Reconstruction, the effort to remake the defeated South and secure the rights of newly freed African Americans, was collapsing by the time Theodore was a teenager, undermined by violence, political compromise, and a weakening of national will, and the Compromise of 1877 that formally ended it coincided almost exactly with his college years. Meanwhile, the post-war decades were producing a different kind of transformation entirely, an explosive, chaotic industrial boom, as railroads stretched across the continent, as steel and oil fortunes rose overnight, and as a small number of men history would come to call robber barons, accumulated wealth and power on a scale the country had never seen. This was the beginning of what would later be labeled the Gilded Age, a term meant to suggest a glittering surface over a far less attractive interior, and its politics were correspondingly rotten in many places, with elected offices at every level bought, sold, and traded for favors, and the machinery of city and state government often serving private interests before public ones. For a young man of Roosevelt's temperament, one who had already learned that willpower could reshape a failing body, the spectacle of a nation whose civic body seemed similarly weakened by neglect and corruption presented, in time, an almost irresistible challenge. That reckoning, however, still lay a few years ahead of him when he arrived at Harvard. He entered Harvard College in the fall of 1876, and the experience broadened him in ways that went well beyond the classroom. Harvard exposed Theodore to young men from backgrounds different from his own insulated New York upbringing, to new ideas in science and philosophy, and to the sort of ambitious, confident social world that would later serve him well in politics and public life. He boxed, he rode, he studied natural history with real seriousness, initially intending to become a scientist, and he began to write, producing early work that showed the vivid, energetic prose style that would later fill dozens of published volumes. He was, by his own later admission, not the most naturally brilliant student at Harvard, but he compensated with the same relentless application he had brought to his physical training, rising early, working with focus, and refusing to let any subject defeat him through sheer effort rather than natural genius. It was also at Harvard, in the winter of his sophomore year, that he met Alice Hathaway Lee, a beautiful, spirited 17-year-old from a prominent Massachusetts family, at the home of a mutual friend in nearby Chestnut Hill. Theodore, not a man given to half measures in anything, fell for her almost immediately and with total conviction. He courted her with the same disciplined intensity he applied to everything else, writing to her constantly, visiting whenever he could, and eventually proposing, only to be refused at first. He persisted, and eventually she agreed. It took nearly 2 years of careful courtship before Alice said yes, and Theodore recorded his happiness in his diary in language of pure, unguarded joy, describing her as the most beautiful woman he had ever known and himself as the luckiest man alive. Their engagement was shadowed, however, by a loss that struck Theodore hard during his junior year at Harvard, the sudden death of his father in February 1878, from what was later understood to be colon cancer, though at the time the diagnosis and its progression were agonizing and poorly explained to the family. Theodore Sr. had been the single most important moral compass in his son's life, the man whose approval Theodore sought above anyone else's, and his death when Theodore was only 19 and away at college was a devastating blow. Theodore was not even present at his father's actual passing, having been delayed in returning to New York, a fact that haunted him. He wrote afterward of an almost physical anguish, a feeling that he had lost not just a father, but the very center of gravity around which his ambitions had organized themselves. It would not be the last time that death arrived suddenly in Theodore Roosevelt's life and reshaped the course of it entirely. But this first great loss taught him something he would carry forward. That grief, however overwhelming, had to be met with continued forward motion, with work, with purpose, because to do otherwise was, in his understanding, a kind of surrender he could not permit himself. Theodore graduated from Harvard in 1880, married Alice Hathaway Lee on his 22nd birthday, October 27th of that year, in a joyous ceremony that friends and family remembered as radiant with happiness, and settled with her in New York, ostensibly to study law at Columbia. But law school held little appeal for a young man of Roosevelt's restless temperament, and he found himself drawn instead, almost by accident, into the rough and unglamorous world of New York City ward politics. This was, in the years following the Civil War, a political landscape dominated by machine politics, patronage, and outright corruption, most infamously embodied by Tammany Hall and figures like the notorious Boss Tweed, whose theft of public funds had scandalized the nation only a few years earlier. Politics, for a man of Roosevelt's social class, was widely considered an unrespectable pursuit, something left to saloon-keepers and ward heelers rather than Harvard-educated gentlemen. Friends and family members openly discouraged him from getting involved, warning that he would find himself in the company of what one relative called a low set of fellows. Roosevelt's response revealed the core of his political philosophy for the rest of his life. He replied that if that was true of the governing class, then he intended to help make the governing class one that gentlemen of education and means would not be ashamed to belong to, and that if men like himself refused to participate, they would have no right to complain about the men who did. It was a decision that ran directly against the grain of his social world, and it marked the true beginning of his public career. He joined the local Republican Political Association in his Manhattan district, attended meetings above saloons filled with cigar smoke, and impressed the ward leaders with an energy and directness that was unusual among the young men of his background who typically kept politics at arm's length. In 1881, at just 23 years old, he was elected to the New York State Assembly, becoming its youngest member. He arrived in Albany looking, by every account, almost comically out of place among the older, rougher, more experienced legislators, dressed in the height of fashionable Eastern style, speaking in a high, clipped voice that some mistook for affectation, and displaying a level of nervous energy that led some of his fellow assemblymen to nickname him, not entirely kindly at first, Jane Dandy, or other mocking variations. But it did not take long for his colleagues, and more importantly the public, to recognize that beneath the fashionable exterior was a legislator of unusual seriousness and courage. Roosevelt threw himself into investigating corruption with a single-mindedness that startled the political establishment, most famously in his pursuit of a corrupt scheme involving a judge named Theodore Westbrook, who was found to have colluded improperly with the financier Jay Gould in a railroad receivership case designed to benefit Gould's business interests at public expense. Roosevelt, freshman legislator that he was, stood on the floor of the Assembly and demanded a formal investigation into the judge's conduct, defying pressure from more senior and more cautious party leaders who preferred the matter be quietly dropped. The investigation ultimately failed to produce a conviction, the political machinery of the era being what it was, but Roosevelt's willingness to challenge powerful interests directly, publicly, and without apparent fear of the consequences to his own career made him a minor sensation in the newspapers and established the reputation for fearless reform that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was re-elected twice, continuing to push measures aimed at civil service reform and against corrupt practices, gaining experience in the practical machinery of legislation and in the equally important art of building alliances, even as he remained, at his core, a man more comfortable fighting than compromising. The Westbrook affair, in particular, taught him lessons that went beyond the specific case, lessons about how power actually protected itself in American public life. He learned that the men who ran political machines, whether Democratic bosses at Tammany Hall or the equally entrenched Republican organization upstate led by figures like Senator Roscoe Conkling, generally cared far less about ideology than about the steady, quiet distribution of jobs, contracts, and favors, and that any reformer who threatened that distribution could expect resistance dressed up in procedural objections rather than open argument. Roosevelt discovered that righteous indignation alone, however genuine, was not enough to defeat a well-entrenched machine. It had to be paired with painstaking research, careful use of the press, and a willingness to keep pressing an issue publicly even after party leaders made clear they wished it would simply go away. He also discovered, to his own evident surprise, that he possessed a real talent for capturing public attention, that his youth, his obvious sincerity, and his flair for a vivid, quotable phrase made him useful copy for newspapermen looking for a compelling story amid the usual gray procedural coverage of Albany politics. He did not always win his legislative battles. Many of his reform bills were watered down, delayed, or quietly killed in committee by men who had been managing the machinery of New York politics since before Roosevelt was born. But he was building something during these Albany years that mattered more, in the long run, than any single piece of legislation. A public identity as a man who could not be bought, intimidated, or worn down, an identity he would carry with him and continually reinforce for the rest of his career. Through these years of political apprenticeship, Roosevelt's personal life seemed to be unfolding with equal promise. His marriage to Alice was, by all surviving accounts, a deeply happy one. They set up a home together, and in 1884 they were expecting their first child. Roosevelt was in Albany attending to assembly business in early February of that year when he received a telegram informing him that Alice had given birth to a healthy daughter, whom they would name Alice Lee Roosevelt after her mother. He was elated and prepared to return to New York as quickly as possible to see his wife and newborn child. But a second telegram followed almost immediately, this one far more alarming, warning him that both his wife and his mother, who lived in the same house, were gravely ill. Roosevelt rushed for the earliest train out of Albany, but a thick fog had settled over the Hudson Valley that night, slowing his journey for hours that must have felt unbearable. He did not arrive at the family home on West 57th Street until close to midnight. What he found there was almost beyond comprehension. His mother, Mittie, only 48 years old, was dying of typhoid fever, a disease that had progressed rapidly and with little warning. In an adjoining room, his wife Alice, only 22, was dying of Bright's disease, a kidney ailment that had been masked during her pregnancy and had only become catastrophically apparent after the delivery of their daughter, compounded by complications that doctors of the period had little ability to treat. Roosevelt spent that final night moving between the two rooms, holding his wife in his arms as her condition deteriorated, then going to sit with his dying mother, then back again, in a horror of helplessness that no amount of willpower or discipline could alter. Mitty died in the early hours of the morning of February 14th, 1884. Alice died that same afternoon, in her husband's arms, having never fully regained consciousness enough to understand that her mother-in-law had already passed. Roosevelt was 25 years old, and within the span of 11 hours, on Valentine's Day, he had lost both his mother and his wife. It is difficult, even at a distance of more than a century, to convey how singular and cruel this coincidence of loss truly was. Bright's disease was, at the time, a condition doctors understood mainly by its symptoms rather than its cause, and its danger during pregnancy was not well recognized. Alice had seemed, to those around her, to be simply experiencing an unusually difficult confinement, with no one anticipating that the underlying kidney failure would prove fatal within days of the birth. Typhoid fever, meanwhile, was a common and much-feared killer in 19th-century cities, spread through contaminated water and food, capable of moving from first symptoms to death in under 2 weeks, and Mitty's case had advanced with a speed that left the family reeling even before Alice's condition worsened. That two such different, unrelated illnesses should strike the same house, felling 2 women Roosevelt loved without reservation. On the very day his family should have been celebrating the birth of his first child, was a cruelty that friends who knew him well said he never spoke about if he could possibly avoid it. His sister Bammy, who had been present throughout the ordeal, later recalled the sheer disbelief in the house that night, the sense that fate had delivered a blow so disproportionate to anything the family had done to deserve it that there was almost nothing coherent to say. Roosevelt's political colleagues in Albany, informed by telegram, were similarly stunned. He had left the assembly chamber only days earlier in a state of undisguised joy at the news of his daughter's birth, and his return in mourning, first for one loss and then, within hours, for a second, left even hardened political operators searching for words. The scale of that loss is almost impossible to overstate, and its documented effect on Roosevelt was profound. In his diary for that day, he marked a large cross and wrote only the words, "The light has gone out of my life," a rare moment in which this famously voluble and expressive man found himself almost entirely unable to articulate his grief in any extended way. He rarely spoke of Alice again for the rest of his life, and in the massive autobiography he wrote decades later, recounting nearly every phase of his eventful career in detail, he did not mention her by name even once, an omission so total that it can only be read as evidence of a wound too deep to revisit in public. His infant daughter was given into the care of his sister Bammy while Roosevelt, unable to bear the presence of the child as a living reminder of what he had lost, and unable to find any peace in New York, made the decision that would reshape the next chapter of his life entirely. He resolved to leave the city, leave politics, at least for a time, and travel west, to the wild, unsettled expanse of the Dakota Territory, a place he had first glimpsed the previous year on a hunting trip and had found strangely, powerfully compelling. He had already invested in a cattle ranching operation there before the tragedy struck. Now, in his grief, that distant, difficult, uncivilized country became something closer to a refuge, and perhaps, though he might not have articulated it this way himself, a place where physical exhaustion and constant labor might crowd out a pain that intellect and willpower alone could not master. The Dakota Badlands that Roosevelt arrived in during the autumn of 1883, and to which he returned in the aftermath of his double tragedy in 1884, were a landscape almost designed to humble a man used to the comforts of Manhattan drawing rooms. Where the grassy plains of the Dakota Territory suddenly buckled and eroded into a maze of jagged buttes, deep ravines, and multicolored cliffs carved over millennia by the Little Missouri River, the land seemed to belong to an older, harsher world entirely. The buttes glowed in shades of ochre, gray, and rust at sunset, and the wind carried across them with a force that could knock a careless rider from his saddle. Summers were brutally hot, the air shimmering over the dry grass, while winters descended with a violence that Easterners simply could not conceive of in advance, temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero, blizzards arriving without warning and burying cattle alive in drifts taller than a man, the cold so absolute that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. It was into this country that Roosevelt had already sunk a substantial sum of money, purchasing an interest in the Maltese Cross Ranch, a modest cabin operation south of the boomtown of Medora, and he would soon establish a second, more remote ranch 35 miles to the north along the river, which he named Elkhorn, after a pair of interlocked elk antlers he found near the site. Roosevelt had first come to this country in September of 1883, before either tragedy had touched his life, on a hunting expedition aimed chiefly at shooting a bison before the last of the great herds vanished entirely from the plains. He had arrived at the tiny, rough frontier settlement of Little Missouri, across the river from the slightly more established town of Medora, itself barely a year old and named by its founder, a flamboyant French nobleman, after his wife. The trip had been intended as a brief excursion, a few weeks at most, but something in the vastness of the country, the silence of the buttes at dawn, the sheer scale of sky pressing down over land that seemed to stretch without limit in every direction, had taken hold of him in a way he had not anticipated. Within days of arriving, he had not only shot his bison, after a grueling, sodden chase through days of rain that left him and his guide exhausted and half-frozen, but had also decided, with the same suddenness that characterized so many of his decisions, to invest in cattle ranching there, striking a deal with two experienced local ranchmen to manage a herd on his behalf. He returned to New York still describing the Badlands with an almost startled enthusiasm, the fashionable young assemblyman suddenly full of talk about buttes and coulees and the particular quality of light on the Little Missouri at evening. And it was to this same wild, half-formed attachment that he returned 5 months later, no longer a curious tourist, but a broken man in search of something the civilized world could not offer him. Life on the ranch bore no resemblance whatsoever to the political and social world Roosevelt had left behind. He rose before dawn and worked full days alongside his hired hands, branding cattle and choking clouds of dust, mending fences and punishing heat, riding for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch across rough, broken country in pursuit of stray animals, sleeping some nights in the open under enormous prairie skies with only a saddle for a pillow. The physical demands were extreme even for a man who had spent a decade building up his body, and the local cowboys, hardened men who had spent their lives on horseback and viewed Easterners, dismissively nicknamed dudes, with open skepticism, watched Roosevelt closely at first, expecting the fashionable, spectacled New Yorker with the strange high voice to fail quickly and go home. He did not. He fell from his horse repeatedly in his early months, ruined more than one mount through inexperienced handling, and endured aching muscles and blistered hands without complaint, gradually earning, through sheer persistence rather than any natural gift for ranch work, the grudging and then genuine respect of the men around him. He learned to rope, to brand, to read the weather and the land, to endure discomforts that would have driven most men of his class back to New York within a month. He also proved, on more than one occasion, that his willingness to fight had not diminished. In a famous incident at a saloon in the town of Mingusville, a drunken local tried to bully and humiliate the bespectacled newcomer, mocking his appearance and daring him to buy drinks for the house at gunpoint. Roosevelt, recognizing that backing down would destroy any standing he might have among the men whose respect he needed, struck the man with a series of rapid punches before he could fire, dropping him to the floor, an episode that circulated widely and did a great deal to establish his credibility in a country where physical courage counted for more than pedigree. The rhythms of ranch life themselves were dictated entirely by the seasons and by the demands of the herd rather than by any calendar Roosevelt had known in New York or Albany. Spring meant the roundup, when ranchers across the territory combined their outfits into a single sprawling operation, riders fanning out across hundreds of square miles of open range to gather cattle that had wintered wherever they pleased, driving them back toward the home ranches to be sorted, counted, and branded according to their owners' marks. It was exhausting, unglamorous work performed in mud and dust from before sunrise until well after dark, punctuated by sudden bursts of danger when a half-wild longhorn steer turned to charge a horse, or a cutting pony stumbled in a prairie dog hole at a dead run. Roosevelt took his turn at night herding as well, riding slow circles around a bedded herd through the darkest hours, singing softly to keep the cattle calm and himself awake. a task the veteran cowboys considered menial, but which Roosevelt approached, as he approached everything, as an opportunity to prove himself equal to the work rather than above it. He ate the same food as his hands, mostly beans, bacon, bread, and endless strong coffee, slept in the same bunkhouses, and asked no favors on account of his wealth or his Eastern education, a fact the men around him noticed and, gradually, respected. Visitors from the East who occasionally passed through Medora and encountered the former assemblyman on horseback, sunburned, weathered, and indistinguishable at a glance from any other rancher on the Little Missouri, often expressed genuine astonishment at the transformation, unable quite to square this figure with the slight, fashionably dressed young man they remembered from New York drawing rooms only a few years before. Hunting formed another central strand of his Dakota years, pursued with the same disciplined intensity he brought to everything else. He tracked and killed bison at a time when the once countless herds that had covered the plains were being slaughtered toward near extinction, and Roosevelt's own writings from this period show an early, developing awareness of just how quickly that magnificent abundance was being destroyed, a concern that would later flower into the conservation policies for which he became famous as president. He hunted elk, deer, and bighorn sheep through country that demanded extraordinary endurance to traverse, often riding or walking for days through canyons and over ridgelines in pursuit of a single animal, sleeping rough, eating whatever could be carried or shot along the way. He wrote about these experiences in detailed, vivid prose for Eastern magazines and later collected them into books, becoming, almost incidentally, one of the more respected outdoor writers of his generation, a man whose first-hand authority on hunting and ranching in the American West lent weight to everything he wrote. These long hunting expeditions were rarely comfortable and sometimes genuinely dangerous. He once tracked a wounded grizzly bear into thick brush, a pursuit that experienced frontier hunters generally regarded as one of the most hazardous things a man could do, since a wounded grizzly was capable of charging from concealment with almost no warning and enough force to kill a man in seconds. Roosevelt's own account of finally killing the animal at close range, describing the bear's small, glittering, malevolent eyes as it rose up almost within arm's reach, became one of the most vivid passages in his early writing. He crossed swollen rivers on horseback at real risk to himself, endured hailstorms and sudden blizzards far from any shelter, and on more than one occasion went hungry for a day or more when a hunt ran longer than expected and supplies ran out. Yet he wrote about all of it not merely as adventure for its own sake, but as a form of education, describing in careful, almost scientific detail the behavior, habitat, and population of the animals he pursued, and increasingly voicing concern, in his letters and in his published work, about the speed with which the great herds of the plains, the bison above all, were being wiped out by uncontrolled market hunting. This was not yet the fully formed conservation philosophy of his presidency, but the seeds of it are unmistakably present in the notebooks he kept along the Little Missouri, in his growing conviction that the wild abundance he had ridden out to witness might not exist for the next generation unless someone with influence chose to protect it. Perhaps no single episode from these years better illustrates the character Roosevelt was forging in the Badlands than his pursuit of a group of boat thieves in the harsh winter of 1886. Someone had stolen a boat belonging to Roosevelt's Elkhorn Ranch, drifting it downriver, an act that in that lawless country, with almost no organized law enforcement for hundreds of miles, might easily have been left unpunished by anyone with less stubborn a sense of justice than Roosevelt possessed. Rather than let the theft go, he had a makeshift flat-bottomed boat built and set off down the ice-choked Little Missouri River in pursuit, accompanied by two of his ranch hands, in temperatures far below freezing, through a landscape offering no shelter and no help if anything went wrong. The chase took the better part of 2 weeks, through brutal cold, with the men forced to break through river ice by hand at times to keep moving, living on meager rations, sleeping in the open. When they finally caught up with and captured the thieves, Roosevelt, ever mindful of law and order even in a place with barely any formal legal apparatus, refused suggestions from his companions that the simplest solution would be to hang the men on the spot, a common enough practice in that unforgiving country. Instead, he insisted on bringing them back for proper trial, a decision that meant an even longer, more grueling overland trek to deliver the prisoners to the authorities, during which Roosevelt himself, at one point, stayed awake for nearly 40 consecutive hours guarding the captives alone, walking them at gunpoint across the frozen prairie because he did not trust anyone else to keep watch. It was an act that could easily have gotten him killed, undertaken over a stolen boat worth perhaps a few dollars, but Roosevelt's insistence on principle over convenience, and his refusal to take the easier, harsher path of frontier justice, became one of the defining stories that Dakota Territory told about him, cementing his local reputation as a man who backed his convictions with genuine physical courage. Yet for all these hard-won triumphs of character, Roosevelt's ranching enterprise itself was, in purely financial terms, heading toward disaster, a fact that became catastrophically clear during the notorious winter of 1886 to 1887, remembered across the northern plains simply as the Great Die-Up, a grim inversion of the traditional springtime roundup known as the Roundup. An unusually dry summer had left the grasslands depleted heading into autumn, weakening the cattle before winter even began, and then the winter itself arrived with a ferocity even by Dakota standards, blizzard after blizzard burying the range in snow, temperatures plunging far below zero for extended stretches, ice storms sealing the remaining grass beneath layers the starving cattle could not break through. Roosevelt's herds, like those of virtually every rancher across the territory, were decimated. When the snows finally melted in the spring and the ranchers rode out to assess the damage, they found the landscape littered with the frozen and rotting carcasses of cattle that had died standing up against fences, drifted against riverbanks, starved and frozen in staggering numbers. Roosevelt himself estimated that he lost the majority of his herd and a substantial portion of the capital he had invested in the ranching venture, a financial blow that essentially ended his career as a cattle rancher, even though he retained his ranches and continued to visit the Badlands for years afterward. The financial failure, however devastating in the moment, was not the story that history would ultimately remember about Roosevelt's years in Dakota, and in a sense it was almost beside the point of what those years had actually given him. He had gone west a grieving, brittle young man, a widower with an infant daughter, uncertain whether the disciplined, driven identity he had built for himself in the gymnasiums and legislative chambers of the East could survive contact with genuine catastrophe. He returned east by 1886 and increasingly by 1887 and 1888, having proven to himself, through daily, physical, undeniable experience, that it could. He had ridden with cowboys who initially mocked him and had won their respect. He had faced down an armed bully rather than submit to humiliation. He had tracked thieves across a frozen wilderness rather than let injustice stand, and had then insisted on due process rather than vengeance, even when vengeance would have been far easier. He had endured the loss of a fortune in cattle without abandoning the character he had built around endurance and discipline. The intellectual, asthmatic boy who had once needed his father to carry him through the night air just to breathe had become, through years of relentless, deliberate effort, a man capable of surviving the harshest environment North America had to offer, a transformation so complete that many Americans who encountered the rugged rancher-hunter-rider emerging from the Badlands in the late 1880s found it almost impossible to reconcile him with the frail, fashionable young assemblyman who had first entered Albany politics less than a decade before. He was not finished with Dakota Territory, and Dakota Territory was not finished with him. He would return to it in memory and occasionally in person for the rest of his life, and would later say that he never would have become president had it not been for his experiences in the Badlands. The men he came to know there, the cowboys and hunters and small ranchers who had once mocked his spectacles and his Eastern voice, would resurface years later in one of the more improbable chapters of his career, when he called on them to help fill the ranks of a volunteer cavalry regiment bound for war. That, however, belonged to a future still some years distant. For now, what mattered was the quieter, more personal reckoning taking place within him as he prepared to leave the Badlands behind. His remarriage, in December of 1886, to Edith Kermit Caro, a woman he had known since early childhood and had once, long before Alice, been close to, marked the emotional turning point that finally allowed him to move forward without the sense that doing so was a betrayal of what he had lost. The wedding took place quietly in London, and by the time he brought his new wife back to New York, he was already looking toward reclaiming his daughter, young Alice, from the aunt who had raised her during his years of self-imposed exile, and toward rebuilding a settled domestic life to stand alongside the far more rugged identity he had built for himself out west. But by the time he packed up to return more permanently to New York and the East, Roosevelt was, in every meaningful sense, a different man than the one who had fled west in grief 3 years earlier. He was harder, more self-possessed, more physically formidable, and more certain than ever that willpower, discipline, and courage applied without flinching could carry a man through almost anything life set in his path. He carried with him now not just the polish of Harvard and the political education of Albany, but the hard, tested authority of a man who had ridden the open range, faced down violent men, endured the coldest winters the continent could produce, and buried both a mother and a wife on the same terrible day without being broken by it. New York, and soon enough the nation, was about to discover just how far that combination of qualities could take him, as Theodore Roosevelt turned his gaze back toward the very world of public service and political reform he had left behind, ready now for a stage far larger than the one he had known before. The New York that Theodore Roosevelt returned to in the closing years of the 1880s was not so different, on its surface, from the city he had left in grief 3 years earlier. But he himself had changed so thoroughly that old acquaintances sometimes needed a moment to reconcile the sunburned, thickly built man before them with the fashionable young assemblyman they remembered. He set about rebuilding his life with the same deliberate purpose he had once applied to strengthening his lungs. He and Edith settled first into rented quarters and then, before long, into the sprawling house at Sagamore Hill on Long Island that he had begun building even before their marriage, on a bluff overlooking Long Island Sound, a home he had originally envisioned sharing with Alice and had very nearly abandoned in the aftermath of her death, before deciding instead to make it the center of an entirely new family life. Edith brought to their household a calm, practical steadiness that differed markedly from the romantic intensity of his first marriage, and she managed the family's finances and domestic affairs with a competence that freed Roosevelt to pursue his restless public ambitions without the distraction of household worry. Their reunion also meant confronting a matter Roosevelt had avoided directly for nearly 3 years. His daughter Alice, who had been raised since infancy by his sister Bammy and who scarcely knew her own father as anything other than an occasional, energetic visitor. Bringing the child back into his own household was not without its emotional complications, both for Roosevelt, who still could not bring himself to speak of the child's mother by name, and for young Alice herself, who would spend much of her childhood keenly aware that she represented, to her father, both a source of love and an unspoken reminder of grief he preferred not to revisit. Edith raised her stepdaughter alongside the children she and Roosevelt would go on to have together, and the household at Sagamore Hill grew, over the following years, into the boisterous, book-filled, animal-populated home that visitors would later describe with a mixture of admiration and mild alarm. Given Roosevelt's tendency to allow his children extraordinary freedom to keep pets ranging from ponies to snakes to a one-legged rooster. Politically, Roosevelt wasted little time re-establishing himself. He had kept a hand in Republican Party affairs even during his years in the Badlands, returning periodically to New York for political business and maintaining correspondence with reform-minded allies. And in 1886, he had already made one attempt at elected office, running for mayor of New York City on the Republican ticket in a three-way race that also included the labor reformer Henry George and the eventual winner, the Democratic candidate Abram Hewitt. Roosevelt's campaign that autumn had been hastily organized, launched not long after his return from Dakota, and complicated by lingering questions among some Republican leaders about whether so young and unpredictable a figure could be trusted with the office. He campaigned energetically, delivering speeches with the same rapid, forceful cadence that had marked his years in Albany, but the crowded field worked against him, and he finished a distant third, a result that stung his pride even as it taught him something valuable about the difference between the kind of localized, reform-minded reputation he had built in Albany and the far larger, more complicated coalition building required to win citywide office in a metropolis as fractured by class, ethnicity, and party loyalty as New York had become. It was, in its way, a useful early defeat, one that cooled some of his more impatient assumptions about how quickly a reputation for integrity alone could translate into electoral victory, without in any way diminishing his appetite for public service. That appetite found a new outlet in 1889, when the newly inaugurated Republican president, Benjamin Harrison, appointed Roosevelt to the United States Civil Service Commission in Washington, a position that might have seemed, to a less determined man, like a quiet, technical sinecure far from the center of national power. The commission had been created only a few years earlier, following the assassination of President James Garfield by a disappointed office seeker in 1881, an event that had shocked the country into passing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which established the principle that at least some federal jobs should be awarded on the basis of competitive examination rather than pure political patronage. In practice, however, the commission Roosevelt joined had limited authority, covered only a fraction of federal positions, and was widely regarded within Washington as a body to be managed, humored, and largely ignored by the powerful party bosses and cabinet secretaries who still depended on patronage to reward loyal supporters. Roosevelt had no intention of being ignored. He approached the commission's narrow legal mandate the way he had approached the Westbrook investigation years before in Albany, treating every technical power available to him as an instrument to be used to its fullest extent, and he began aggressively investigating instances of fraud in civil service examinations, exposing rigged tests, forged scores, and outright bribery in post offices and customs houses across the country, often traveling personally to distant cities to conduct investigations rather than relying solely on subordinates. He clashed repeatedly and publicly with powerful members of his own party, including cabinet officials who resented having a junior commissioner expose the patronage arrangements that kept their political machines running, and his willingness to fight even members of the administration that had appointed him became, once again, a source of both admiration in the press and considerable irritation among Republican leaders who had hoped for a quieter commissioner. The broader political atmosphere of these years, the period historians would come to call the Gilded Age, made Roosevelt's kind of reform exceptionally difficult to sustain. The two major parties, Republican and Democratic, were closely matched in national strength through the 1880s and into the 1890s, and this rough parity meant that party organizations on both sides had powerful incentives to hold together every faction, every local boss, every patronage network they could muster, since even small defections could tip a close national election. Reform, in this environment, was often seen by party regulars not as a virtue but as a threat, a disruptive force that risked alienating the very local organizations upon which national victories depended. Newspapers of the era were themselves frequently entangled with party interests, and the public appetite for genuine, sustained reform tended to rise and fall with periodic scandals rather than remaining a constant political pressure. Against this backdrop, a reformer who refused to soften his approach for the sake of party harmony risked isolating himself from the very institutions he needed in order to accomplish anything at all. Roosevelt navigated this danger imperfectly, but with remarkable persistence, cultivating relationships with sympathetic newspaper editors, particularly those associated with the growing movement of investigative, fact-based journalism that would later be labeled muckraking, and using public exposure as a weapon when official channels proved unresponsive. He served 6 years on the Civil Service Commission, spanning both the Harrison administration and, after Grover Cleveland's return to the presidency in 1893, a Democratic administration that nonetheless found Roosevelt's aggressive, nonpartisan pursuit of civil service fraud useful enough to retain him in the post, a rare bipartisan endorsement of his effectiveness that did a great deal to build his reputation nationally as a public servant motivated by principle rather than party loyalty. Alone, by the time Roosevelt left Washington in 1895, he had become one of the most recognizable reform figures in American public life, a man whose name newspaper readers across the country associated with energy, integrity, and an almost theatrical willingness to confront entrenched corruption regardless of which party benefited from it. It was this reputation that led a group of reform-minded New York civic leaders to recruit him for a new position that would prove, in many ways, the most vivid and publicly visible chapter of his career to that point: president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. New York's police department in the mid-1890s was widely regarded as one of the most corrupt institutions in American municipal government, a force in which promotions, assignments, and even continued employment were routinely bought and sold, in which officers collected regular payoffs from brothels, gambling houses, and illegal saloons operating in open violation of the city's own laws, and in which the department's senior leadership was deeply entangled with the Tammany Hall political machine that had long treated the police as an extension of its own patronage empire. A legislative investigation known as the Lexow Committee had spent much of 1894 exposing this corruption in exhaustive, headline-generating detail, describing a department in which officers openly extorted business owners and in which entire precincts operated essentially as protection rackets, and the public outrage generated by these revelations had helped elect a reform mayor, William Strong, who assembled a bipartisan board of police commissioners and asked Roosevelt to serve as its president. Roosevelt threw himself into the position with an energy that startled even a city accustomed to his reputation for restless activity. He insisted on strict enforcement of existing laws, including an unpopular Sunday closing law for saloons that had previously been ignored in exchange for regular bribes to police officers, a stance that alienated much of the city's saloon-going working class and the political machine that depended on their goodwill, even as it won him praise from reformers and temperance advocates. He worked to modernize recruitment and promotion within the department, pushing for physical and written examinations to replace the old system of political appointment. And he pursued corrupt officers with the same investigative persistence he had brought to the Civil Service Commission, forcing out or prosecuting officers found guilty of extortion and neglect of duty. Perhaps most memorably, and most characteristically, Roosevelt took to walking the city's streets himself, late at night, often in disguise or at least without announcing his presence in advance, accompanied on occasion by journalists he trusted, to observe firsthand whether patrolmen were actually walking their beats or, as was disturbingly common, sleeping in doorways, drinking in the very saloons they were meant to be monitoring, or simply absent from their posts entirely. These nighttime inspections took him into some of the city's most dangerous districts, the tenement blocks of the Lower East Side and the notorious dive bars of the Tenderloin, on foot and often alone or with only a single companion, at hours when a man of his social standing would ordinarily never have set foot in such neighborhoods. He caught officers derelict in their duty with startling regularity, and rather than quietly reprimanding them through internal channels, he made a point of publicizing these encounters, giving interviews to reporters the following morning describing exactly which patrolman he had found asleep or drinking and exactly where, a tactic that embarrassed the department publicly and made clear to every officer on the force that the new commissioner might, quite literally, be watching from the shadows. On any given night, the public reaction to all of this was a mixture of genuine admiration and considerable ridicule. Newspapers delighted in the spectacle of a police commissioner prowling the streets after midnight, and Roosevelt's distinctive appearance, the spectacles, the prominent teeth bared in an unmistakable grin, the booming voice, made him an irresistible subject for the era's cartoonists, who portrayed him repeatedly in his nighttime rounds, often accompanied by a bulldog or rendered with exaggerated menace as he loomed over cowering patrolmen caught asleep on duty. Reformers hailed him as exactly the kind of vigorous, incorruptible official the city desperately needed, while critics, including many within his own party who depended on the old patronage arrangements, accused him of theatrical self-promotion and of pursuing reforms, particularly the strict Sunday closing enforcement, with a rigidity that ignored the practical realities and cultural habits of the immigrant working-class neighborhoods most affected. Roosevelt himself seemed largely undisturbed by the criticism, and in many respects appeared to relish the combination of genuine reform and public spectacle that his tenure had become. He understood, perhaps better than most politicians of his generation, that visibility itself was a form of political power, that a public which could picture its officials actually walking the beat at midnight was a public more likely to believe reform was actually happening, whatever the more complicated administrative realities underneath. His 2 years atop the police board did not solve corruption in the New York Police Department permanently, and many of the old patterns would reassert themselves after his departure, But the position had accomplished something arguably more important for his own trajectory. It had made him, by the mid-1890s, one of the most famous and most visually distinctive public officials in the entire country, a reputation that reached well beyond New York and into national political circles increasingly. Curious about this energetic reformer with the improbable combination of Harvard polish and frontier toughness. That national attention translated into a new appointment in 1897, when the newly elected Republican president, William McKinley, at the urging of Roosevelt's old political allies, including the influential Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, offered him the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was, on paper, a subordinate role, technically answerable to the Secretary of the Navy, John Long, an older, more cautious man of gentler temperament who had little appetite for the kind of aggressive institutional shakeup that had characterized Roosevelt's previous postings. But for Roosevelt, the position was in some ways a natural culmination of interests he had nurtured since boyhood. As a young man, still in his 20s, he had written and published a serious scholarly work titled The Naval War of 1812, a detailed technical and strategic analysis of the naval engagements of that conflict that had been praised by professional naval officers and historians alike for its rigor, and that remained, decades later, a standard reference on the subject. This early expertise reflected a broader conviction Roosevelt had developed over years of reading history and observing the shifting balance of global power, that a modern nation's strength, prosperity, and ability to defend its interests depended substantially on the capability of its navy, a conviction he shared with an influential circle of naval strategists and political allies, most notably the naval historian and theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose writings on the historical importance of sea power to national greatness had deeply shaped Roosevelt's own thinking. Roosevelt arrived at the Navy Department not as a curious amateur, but as a genuinely informed advocate for naval modernization, and he set to work with characteristic energy, pushing for the construction of new battleships, the modernization of gunnery training and fleet readiness, and a general acceleration of the naval expansion program that had already begun, more slowly, under previous administrations. He also arrived at a moment of rising international tension that made his enthusiasm for naval preparedness feel, to him at least, increasingly urgent rather than merely theoretical. Cuba, still a colony of Spain, had been engaged for several years in a brutal war for independence, a conflict marked by harsh Spanish counterinsurgency tactics, including the concentration of Cuban civilians into fortified camps where disease and malnutrition killed enormous numbers of people, conditions that American newspapers, particularly the fiercely competitive papers of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, covered in increasingly sensational and often exaggerated detail. American public sympathy for the Cuban independence movement grew steadily through 1897 and into 1898, fueled both by genuine humanitarian concern over reported Spanish atrocities and by the deliberately inflammatory reporting style that critics would later derisively label yellow journalism. Within the McKinley administration itself, opinion was divided and cautious. The president, who had personally witnessed the horrors of the Civil War as a young soldier, was reluctant to commit the United States to armed conflict and pursued diplomatic pressure on Spain for reforms in Cuba, while a more assertive faction, which included Roosevelt, Lodge, and a number of other influential figures increasingly associated with an expansionist vision of American power, argued that Spain's continued misrule in Cuba, combined with broader considerations of American strategic and commercial interest in the Caribbean and Pacific, made conflict likely if not desirable, and that the United States Navy needed to be ready for it. Roosevelt's frustration with his own position grew steadily through this period, a frustration rooted in a tension that had defined much of his adult life, the gap between believing intensely in a cause and being confined to an administrative role that offered no outlet for direct action. He continued to push for naval readiness with real effect, and on at least one notable occasion, when Secretary Long was away from the department for a single afternoon in February of 1898, Roosevelt used the temporary authority of acting secretary to issue a flurry of orders accelerating ammunition purchases, positioning naval vessels, and instructing the commander of the Asiatic Squadron, Commodore George Dewey, to prepare for potential offensive operations against Spanish forces in the Philippines should war break out, orders that would prove strategically significant only months later. Yet these bureaucratic maneuvers, however consequential, did not satisfy a man whose entire life had been organized around the conviction that character was proven through direct, physical action rather than paperwork. The explosion that destroyed the American battleship Maine in Havana Harbor on the 15th of February, 1898, killing more than 200 sailors, dramatically accelerated the drift toward war. Even though the cause of the explosion remained genuinely uncertain at the time and remains a subject of historical debate to this day, with contemporary American investigators concluding it had been caused by an external mine, while other analyses, both then and since, have raised the possibility of an internal accident such as a coal bunker fire igniting the ship's magazines. Whatever its true cause, the destruction of the Maine, amplified by newspaper coverage that declared Spanish sabotage as established fact, pushed American public opinion decisively toward war. And by April of 1898, following the breakdown of last diplomatic efforts, Congress had authorized military intervention and the United States found itself formally at war with Spain. For Roosevelt, the declaration of war resolved a tension he had been wrestling with for months. He had come to believe, with the same moral seriousness that had characterized every previous conviction in his life, that a man who had spent years publicly advocating for American strength and preparedness had no honorable choice but to serve in uniform himself if war actually came, rather than remaining safely behind a desk in Washington directing others into danger. This conviction was not universally shared even among those who admired him. His wife Edith was seriously ill at the time, recovering from a difficult surgery, and friends and family members, along with Secretary Long himself, urged Roosevelt to remain in his post, arguing that his administrative talents and naval expertise were more valuable to the war effort in Washington than his presence on any single battlefield could possibly be. Roosevelt considered these arguments and rejected them, a decision that reveals a great deal about the values that had been building in him since boyhood, that the discipline he had spent decades cultivating in the gymnasium, on the assembly floor, in the Badlands, and in every reform battle since existed, in the end, to be tested at the moment when it mattered most, and that a life spent celebrating strenuous action while personally avoiding the most strenuous action available to him would have felt, to Roosevelt, like a betrayal of everything he had built his identity around. He resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the spring of 1898 to volunteer for active military service, a decision that stunned much of official Washington and that even some of his closest allies privately regarded as reckless given his complete lack of formal military training and his responsibilities as a husband and father of a growing family. The military authorities, recognizing both Roosevelt's genuine usefulness as a rallying figure and the political value of his participation, authorized the formation of a new regiment, officially designated the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, that would soon become known across the country by a far more evocative name, the Rough Riders. Roosevelt was initially offered command of the regiment outright, but with characteristic self-awareness about the limits of his own military experience, he instead recommended that his friend Leonard Wood, an Army physician with genuine combat experience from campaigns against Geronimo and in Cuba's earlier unrest, be given the colonelcy, while Roosevelt himself accepted the position of lieutenant colonel, second in command, a role that would allow him to learn the practical business of military leadership under an experienced officer while still placing him in a position of real authority and, crucially, in a position from which he could lead men directly into combat rather than watching from a staff position at the rear. The recruitment of the regiment itself became one of the most colorful episodes of the entire war, and one that Roosevelt, drawing directly on friendships and connections built during his years in the Badlands, shaped personally and enthusiastically. Word went out to the ranching communities of Dakota, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas that a volunteer cavalry regiment was forming under the joint command of Wood and the famous former police commissioner and rancher Roosevelt, and men came forward in numbers far exceeding what the regiment could actually accept. Cowboys who had spent their lives on horseback and could rope and shoot with a skill no amount of formal military drilling could match, veteran lawmen who had faced down outlaws in frontier towns, former Texas Rangers, and a scattering of Native American recruits, including men who had grown up on reservations in the Indian Territory, all drawn by the regiment's promise of genuine, physical adventure and by Roosevelt's own personal reputation among Westerners as a man who had proven himself, years earlier, capable of holding his own in their world. Alongside these frontiersmen came an equally colorful, and to contemporary observers rather incongruous, contingent recruited from Roosevelt's own social and educational background in the East. Ivy League athletes from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, polo players and champion oarsmen and football stars, along with a scattering of New York policemen who had served under Roosevelt during his police commission years and wished to follow him into battle. Newspapers found the combination irresistible copy, delighting in describing a regiment that assembled cattle punchers and Fifth Avenue clubmen, Comanche and Cherokee horsemen and Harvard oarsmen, under a single command, and the label Rough Riders, borrowed from a phrase already in common use for skilled horsemen of the Western Plains, caught on almost immediately in the press despite Roosevelt's own initial preference for a more formal regimental designation. Training took place at a hastily organized camp in San Antonio, Texas, in the suffocating heat of a Texas May, where the disparate elements of the regiment, men who had never fired a rifle in anger and men who had spent years hunting outlaws and native raiders across the Southwest, men from elite Eastern universities and men who had barely finished grade school, were welded together with remarkable speed into something resembling a cohesive military unit. Wood brought professional discipline and organizational structure to the training, while Roosevelt brought an infectious, almost boyish enthusiasm that men throughout the camp remarked upon, riding constantly among the troops, learning alongside them, mastering the specific vocabulary and procedures of cavalry drill with the same relentless application he had once brought to boxing and ranch work, determined that no man in the regiment would ever have cause to say the former desk-bound Navy official could not keep pace with actual soldiers. The heat was brutal, equipment was often inadequate or slow to arrive, and the logistical challenge of transforming more than 1,000 men of wildly varied backgrounds into a functioning cavalry regiment in a matter of weeks tested everyone involved. Yet accounts from soldiers who served under him consistently describe a growing sense, even in these early weeks of training, that Roosevelt possessed a genuine gift for inspiring loyalty, not through distance and formal authority, but through visible, shared effort and an evident, unfeigned relish for the hardship itself. By the time the regiment received orders to move toward the port of embarkation, the atmosphere among the Rough Riders had become a strange and potent mixture of excitement, impatience, and undisguised uncertainty about what genuinely lay ahead. Few of the men, including Roosevelt himself, had any direct experience of combat, and the newspapers that had so enthusiastically publicized the regiment's colorful composition offered little real insight into what awaited a volunteer cavalry unit landing on hostile, disease-ridden Caribbean terrain against a Spanish colonial army defending fortified positions. Transport proved chaotic. There were not nearly enough ships to carry the regiment's horses to Cuba, forcing Roosevelt and Wood to leave the majority of their mounts behind in Florida, an improvisation that would leave much of a cavalry regiment fighting, when the moment came, on foot. The men who crowded onto the transport ships bound for Cuba in June of 1898 carried with them the accumulated weight of everything that had brought them to this point. Roosevelt's own weight heaviest of all, a childhood spent willing a failing body into strength, a young reformer's belief that courage and integrity could outlast corruption, a rancher's hard-won endurance forged across frozen Dakota winters, a widower's private grief transformed into public purpose, and now, at last, the prospect of the one test he had never yet faced, the test of leading men under direct enemy fire, the strenuous life about to demand of him something no gymnasium, no legislative chamber, and no midnight patrol through the streets of New York had ever required. As the transport ships steamed south out of Tampa Bay into open water, carrying the Rough Riders toward the unfamiliar hills and jungles of eastern Cuba, Roosevelt stood among his men on the threshold of a reckoning that would, within a matter of weeks, transform him permanently in the eyes of the American public, though what exactly awaited them on the other side of that reckoning remained, for every soldier aboard those crowded, sweltering decks, entirely and genuinely unknown. The transports pitched gently as the coastline of Florida shrank into a low gray smear behind them. And for the first time since the regiment had been raised, there was nothing left to do but wait. Nearly 17,000 men were crowded aboard a fleet of more than 30 vessels, chartered in haste from commercial lines never designed to carry troops, and the decks of the Yucatan, where Roosevelt stood with his Rough Riders, were so densely packed that men slept in shifts, taking turns at the rail simply to breathe air that had not already passed through 100 other lungs. Below decks, the heat became something almost solid, a physical presence that pressed down on soldiers already sweating through wool uniforms designed for a temperate climate rather than the Caribbean summer they were sailing into. Many of the men had never seen the ocean before enlisting, and now they watched it for days, the monotony broken only by flying fish skimming the wave tops and by the distant silhouettes of the escorting warships that reminded everyone this was no pleasure cruise. Roosevelt moved constantly among his men during the crossing, unable or unwilling to simply occupy the more comfortable quarters his rank might have afforded him. He asked after their families, checked on the horses when there was room for horses at all, and by every account tried to project a confidence he could not entirely have felt himself. He was 39 years old and had spent his adult life preparing, in one way or another, for a moment like this one. Yet nothing in his previous experience, not the ranches of the Dakotas, not the police commissionership of New York, not even his years of reading military history with an almost obsessive attention to campaigns and tactics, had actually placed him under fire. He wrote to his family with the particular brightness of a man trying to reassure himself as much as them. But those who served alongside him remembered something more complicated. A man acutely aware that he was about to be tested in the one arena he had always believed mattered most, and uncertain, however he masked it, of how he would perform. The uncertainty was not his alone. The volunteers of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry were an unusual assembly even by the standards of a war that had drawn men from every corner of American life. Roosevelt and his co-commander, the professional soldier Leonard Wood, had recruited cowboys and ranch hands from the territories, but also Ivy League athletes, New York policemen, and a scattering of adventurers who had simply wanted to be part of something historic. Newspapers had seized on this mixture and made the Rough Riders famous before they had fired a shot, which meant that the men aboard those transport ships carried not only their own fears but the weight of a public expectation that had already decided, sight unseen, that they were heroes. It was a strange kind of pressure to be famous for a war one had not yet fought, and Roosevelt, who understood public perception as well as any man of his generation, felt it as keenly as anyone. Much of the regiment's horses had been left behind in Tampa, a consequence of the chaotic loading of the transports, in which available cargo space simply ran out before all the animals could be brought aboard. This left a cavalry regiment that would fight, when the moment came, almost entirely on foot, a fact that would matter enormously in the battles ahead, and that even now, during the crossing, unsettled men who had trained and equipped themselves as horse soldiers. Roosevelt himself managed to bring his horse, but the great majority of his men would climb the hills of Cuba as infantry, a circumstance born entirely of logistics rather than design, and one more reminder that the American military machine assembled for this war was improvising at nearly every stage. The food available on the transports did little to ease the discomfort of the crossing. Rations consisted largely of canned meat that spoiled quickly in the heat and hardtack that had to be soaked before it could reasonably be chewed, and fresh water aboard the overcrowded vessels was often rationed carefully, since the ship's distilling equipment struggled to keep pace with the demands of so many men in tropical conditions. Sanitation aboard the transports was primitive at best, and the combination of seasickness among men unaccustomed to ocean travel, the oppressive heat below decks, and the crowding of bodies into spaces never designed for troop transport produced conditions that several soldiers later described in their letters home as more physically miserable than anything they experienced once they reached Cuban soil. Officers attempted to maintain morale through informal entertainments. Impromptu singing, storytelling, and games of cards played by lantern light, and Roosevelt, who possessed a genuine gift for camaraderie despite his patrician background, was remembered by several of his men as someone who moved easily between conversations with Harvard-educated volunteers and Southwestern cowhands alike. drawing out stories and offering his own with equal enthusiasm. The nights during the crossing brought some relief from the daytime heat, and it was during these hours that many of the men, Roosevelt among them, allowed themselves to reflect more openly on what awaited them. Some of the volunteers, particularly the younger ones who had enlisted, swept up in patriotic fervor without any real conception of what combat might involve, spoke openly of their fears, while others, especially the seasoned former lawmen and frontiersmen who made up a considerable portion of the regiment's ranks, approached the prospect of battle with a harder, more matter-of-fact resignation born of lives already accustomed to physical danger. Roosevelt seemed to draw strength from this diversity of temperament among his men, and his own letters from this period reveal a man working consciously to model the calm resolve he hoped his soldiers would find within themselves once the fighting began, even as his private correspondence occasionally betrayed the same uncertainty he worked so hard to keep from public view. After a week that felt considerably longer, the fleet arrived off the northern coast of Cuba near the port town of Daiquiri, and the men caught their first sight of the island they had crossed the sea to fight for. It rose green and mountainous from the water, ringed by palm trees and dense tropical vegetation that many of the soldiers, accustomed to the plains and cities of the United States, had never encountered in such thickness. The landing itself was a study in improvisation bordering on chaos. There were no proper docks capable of handling so many men and so much equipment, and soldiers were ferried ashore in small boats through a modest surf, sometimes leaping the final distance into the water with rifles held overhead. Horses and mules, in scenes that struck many observers as almost comic amid the tension of the moment, were simply pushed off the transports and left to swim for shore, some of them disappearing beneath the waves and drowning in full view of their owners. There was no coordinated command structure managing the landing, no unified timetable, and units became separated from their equipment, their supplies, and sometimes from each other almost immediately upon reaching the beach. What awaited the army once ashore was a landscape as challenging as any opponent. Cuba in late June was gripped by the wet season, and the trails leading inland toward Santiago were narrow, muddy, and hemmed in by jungles so thick that visibility in places extended only a few yards. The heat did not relent with the arrival on land. If anything, it intensified, trapped and thickened by the surrounding vegetation, and the humidity soaked through uniforms within minutes of any exertion. Soldiers accustomed to marching on open American roads now found themselves picking their way along single-file paths, often carrying far more equipment than the conditions warranted, since quartermasters back in Tampa had loaded the ships with an eye toward what might be needed rather than what could realistically be carried through jungle terrain. Disease proved, as it would throughout the Cuban campaign and its aftermath, a more persistent enemy than the Spanish army. Yellow fever and malaria were endemic to the island, and the American military medical establishment, however well-intentioned, had only the vaguest understanding of how these diseases spread. The role of the mosquito as a vector for yellow fever would not be definitively established by Walter Reed and his colleagues until several years later. Men fell ill with fevers that left them shaking and delirious, and the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the camps, combined with contaminated water sources, produced dysentery on a scale that some units found nearly as debilitating as combat casualties. Roosevelt, remarkably, seemed to shrug off the general susceptibility to illness that afflicted so many around him, a fact that some biographers attribute to sheer force of will and others to simple fortune, since medical science of the era could not have explained why one man sickened while his tentmate did not. Supply problems compounded the misery. The chaotic loading in Tampa meant that food, ammunition, and medical supplies did not always arrive where or when they were needed, and soldiers frequently subsisted on inadequate rations, sometimes going without proper meals for a day or more, while waiting for supply trains that struggled over trails barely wide enough for a single mule. Officers found themselves managing not only the tactical problem of an approaching battle but the more immediate crisis of keeping their men fed, watered, and minimally healthy, all while pressing forward through terrain that punished every mile gained. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion, disease, and logistical strain that the first significant engagement of the campaign took place, at a location called Las Guasimas, along the trail leading toward Santiago. On the morning of June 24th, advance elements of the American force, including Roosevelt's Rough Riders alongside regular Army units, encountered Spanish troops positioned in a strong defensive line amid dense brush and rolling terrain that gave the defenders every advantage of concealment. The fighting that followed was confused almost from its first moments, the kind of engagement in which soldiers could hear the crack of rifles and the buzz of bullets passing nearby, without ever clearly seeing the men who were shooting at them. Visibility in the thick chaparral was often reduced to a matter of feet, and commanders on both sides struggled to maintain coherent lines as the action unfolded in patches and pockets rather than along any clean front. Roosevelt, moving with his men through this bewildering terrain, experienced for the first time in his life the particular sensation of being under deliberate, aimed fire, and he would later write about it with the candor that marked much of his personal reflection. The strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, the way time seemed to distort, the sound of bullets that he initially mistook for insects until the reality of what he was hearing became clear. Several of his men were killed or wounded in the fighting at Las Guasimas, a sobering initiation for a regiment that had, until this point, existed largely as a newspaper sensation. The engagement ended in an American tactical success, as Spanish forces withdrew toward their prepared positions closer to Santiago. But it came at a cost that made clear to everyone involved that the romance of war, to whatever extent it had ever existed in the imaginations of these volunteers, was giving way rapidly to its grimmer realities. In the aftermath of Las Guasimas, there emerged one of the first controversies of the campaign, a dispute over whether the American forces had been ambushed through inadequate reconnaissance or had fought a well-managed engagement against a skillfully positioned enemy. Historians have generally concluded that a combination of factors was responsible. The difficult terrain genuinely limited what scouting could accomplish, and the eagerness of American commanders to press the advance, born partly of a desire to seize the initiative before disease could further erode their fighting strength, led to a somewhat hasty approach that left the advancing columns more exposed than ideal planning might have allowed. Roosevelt himself, in his later writings, defended the American conduct of the battle, though modern historians treat his account, like much of his own testimony about the war, with the understanding that he was an interested party recounting events in which his own reputation was very much at stake. The days following Las Guasimas were consumed by the grinding logistics of moving an army towards Santiago along trails that seemed to conspire against every effort at speed. Supply lines stretched thinner with each mile, and the tropical rains that arrived with numbing regularity turned already poor roads into channels of mud that swallowed wagon wheels and exhausted mules. Soldiers marched with wet feet for days at a stretch, developing the kinds of ailments that come from prolonged exposure to damp conditions, while officers wrestled with the challenge of coordinating an advance that involved thousands of men moving through country that had never been designed, in any practical sense, to accommodate a modern army. By the end of June and the beginning of July, the American forces under General William Shafter had drawn close enough to Santiago to contemplate a direct assault on the network of Spanish defensive positions that ringed the city from the high ground to its east, positions anchored by the fortified village of El Caney and the more extensive lines along the San Juan Heights, a low-ridge system that included the rise that would become known to history as Kettle Hill, named for an iron sugar kettle that stood near its crest. The Spanish had spent weeks fortifying these positions with trenches, blockhouses, and barbed wire, and they possessed the considerable defensive advantage of modern Mauser rifles, whose smokeless powder made it exceptionally difficult for attacking American soldiers to locate the source of incoming fire, since the telltale puff of smoke that had marked rifle positions in earlier wars simply did not appear. The American plan called for a coordinated assault, with one force attacking El Caney to eliminate the threat of Spanish reinforcement or flanking fire, while the main body advanced against the San Juan Heights themselves. What was intended as a relatively swift operation against El Caney instead became a prolonged and costly fight that consumed most of the first day, delaying the broader coordination of the assault and leaving the troops advancing against San Juan Heights, including Roosevelt's Rough Riders, waiting for extended periods under harassing fire with limited ability to respond effectively, since their own artillery support was limited and often poorly positioned. It was in this context, on the 1st of July, that Roosevelt found himself facing the defining moment of his military service. With most of the regiment's horses left behind in Tampa, Roosevelt was one of the very few mounted officers present, and he led his men, along with elements of other cavalry units, including the African-American soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, whose courage under fire that day earned recognition even from officers not always inclined to credit black soldiers fairly. In an advance up the slope that would become known as Kettle Hill, the attack was not, contrary to some of the mythology that would develop around it in later decades, a solitary cavalry charge undertaken alone by Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. It was part of a broader, if imperfectly coordinated, assault involving multiple regiments advancing more or less simultaneously against the layered Spanish defenses. And Roosevelt himself was for a portion of the advance without clear orders, moving forward on his own initiative after growing frustrated with delays in the command structure above him. The ascent of Kettle Hill was made under direct rifle fire from Spanish defenders positioned along the crest, and the advancing Americans suffered casualties throughout the climb, men falling in the tall grass as their comrades pressed onward, since to stop moving under such fire was widely understood to be more dangerous than to continue advancing toward cover at the top. Roosevelt, mounted on his horse Little Texas for part of the ascent before eventually continuing on foot, was reportedly among the first to reach the crest of the hill, and eyewitness accounts, along with his own later writing, describe a moment of fierce, close engagement as the Spanish defenders were driven from their positions. From this height, Roosevelt and his men could see the neighboring San Juan Hill, where other American units were engaged in their own brutal ascent against similarly entrenched defenders, and by several accounts Roosevelt urged his own men forward to assist in that fight as well, crossing open ground under fire to add weight to the assault on the adjoining heights. The fighting across the San Juan Heights that day, encompassing both Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill proper, resulted in several hundred American casualties, killed and wounded, and represented the single bloodiest day of the entire Cuban campaign. It was, by the standards of the technology and tactics involved, a remarkably costly assault against fortified positions, and it succeeded in no small part because of the sheer determination of the advancing soldiers rather than because of any particular tactical brilliance in its planning, a point that military historians have made consistently in their assessments of the battle. The Spanish defenders, though occupying strong positions, were ultimately too few in number and too poorly supplied to hold indefinitely against the weight of the American advance, and by the close of the 1st of July, the heights overlooking Santiago had passed into American hands, a position from which the city itself could be directly threatened. Roosevelt's own conduct during the assault became, almost immediately, a subject of intense public fascination back in the United States, where newspaper correspondents traveling with the Army, most notably the writer and journalist Richard Harding Davis, had filed vivid accounts of the fighting that placed Roosevelt at the center of the drama. Davis's dispatches, distributed widely through the American press, described Roosevelt's leadership in terms that bordered on the heroic, and these accounts, combined with Roosevelt's own considerable talent for self-promotion and his genuine personal courage under fire, transformed him almost overnight from a colorful political figure who had resigned a government post to go to war into a certified national hero whose exploits were discussed in every corner of the country. It is worth noting, as later historians have carefully documented, that the actual battle was considerably messier, more collaborative, and more dependent on the courage of many individual units, including the Black Regular Army regiments whose contributions were often understated in contemporary press coverage that focused overwhelmingly on Roosevelt and his volunteers than the popular narrative that emerged in its immediate aftermath suggested. The mythology of the Rough Riders that developed in the following years, encouraged in substantial part by Roosevelt's own subsequent book on the subject, tended to simplify a complicated, multi-unit engagement into a more streamlined story centered on Roosevelt's personal heroism and the romantic image of a volunteer cavalry regiment of cowboys and college athletes charging up a hill against superior numbers. Modern historians, while not disputing Roosevelt's genuine bravery or the real hardships and sacrifices of his men, have worked to restore a fuller picture of the battle, one that credits the coordinated, if imperfect, efforts of multiple regiments, acknowledges the disproportionate casualties suffered by regular Army units, and recognizes the particular courage of Black soldiers whose contributions were often minimized in the immediate press coverage and in Roosevelt's own later writing. Though it should be said that Roosevelt did, at various points, publicly praise their conduct, even as the broader racial attitudes of the era shaped how such praise was framed and received. In the days following the capture of San Juan Heights, American forces settled into a siege of Santiago itself, a period less dramatic than the battle that preceded it, but scarcely less difficult for the soldiers involved, who now faced the accumulating toll of disease in the tropical heat, with yellow fever and malaria spreading through the ranks at a rate that alarmed medical officers and began to threaten the Army's continued fighting capacity more seriously than any Spanish resistance. The Spanish fleet, attempting to escape the American naval blockade of Santiago Harbor, was destroyed in a decisive naval battle on the 3rd of July, an engagement that effectively sealed the fate of the Spanish position in Cuba and set the stage for the eventual surrender of the city on the 17th of July, bringing the ground campaign to a close. With the fighting over, the American Army in Cuba faced a crisis nearly as dangerous as the battles themselves, as tropical disease continued to spread through the ranks with alarming speed, and it became clear to the senior officers on the ground, Roosevelt among them, that the Army risked catastrophic losses if it remained in Cuba through the remainder of the season without evacuation. Roosevelt, never a man inclined toward quiet diplomacy when he believed decisive action was needed, took the controversial step of co-signing a letter, quickly leaked to the press and known afterward as the round-robin letter, that publicly pressed the War Department to remove the Army from Cuba before disease destroyed it entirely. The letter created considerable friction with military and political superiors who felt undermined by a public appeal that bypassed the normal chain of command, but it also achieved its immediate purpose, contributing to the decision to bring the Army home, and it further cemented Roosevelt's public image as a man willing to fight for his soldiers even at the cost of his own standing with superiors. Roosevelt returned to the United States in August of 1898 to a reception that exceeded anything he could reasonably have anticipated, even given his awareness of his own growing fame. Crowds gathered at ports and train stations to catch a glimpse of the man the newspapers had made into the singular hero of the Cuban campaign, and the political calculus of New York Republicans, who had watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and calculation, shifted rapidly in response. Roosevelt, already a figure of some prominence before the war owing to his work as a civil service reformer, as president of the New York City Police Board, and as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had returned home not merely well-known, but genuinely beloved, a distinction that mattered enormously in the practical business of winning elections. The Republican political machine in New York State, led by the shrewd and sometimes ruthless boss Thomas Collier Platt, viewed Roosevelt's new popularity with a complicated mixture of interest and wariness. Platt understood that a candidate with Roosevelt's fame could win the governorship for the party in the fall election of 1898, at a moment when Republican prospects in the state were far from certain. But he also understood, correctly as it turned out, that Roosevelt was not a man inclined to govern as anyone's obedient instrument. The negotiations between Roosevelt and the party organization over his nomination were characterized by exactly this tension, with Platt extracting certain assurances about consultation and cooperation that Roosevelt would honor only selectively once in office, and Roosevelt entering the arrangement with his eyes fully open to the fact that he was allying, temporarily and pragmatically, with political forces whose instincts for corruption and patronage he had spent much of his earlier career opposing. Roosevelt won the governorship in a close election in November of 1898, and his 2 years in Albany that followed established, in miniature, the pattern of reformist governance that would characterize his presidency. He pursued civil service reform with the same energy he had brought to the position years earlier in Washington, where he had served as a federal civil service commissioner working to replace patronage-based government hiring with a merit-based system. And as governor, he extended this same commitment to state government, working to ensure that appointments were made on the basis of competence rather than political loyalty, a practice that directly threatened the patronage networks through which Platt's organization maintained its influence throughout the state. Roosevelt also worked to bring greater regulation and oversight to corporations operating within the state, and pushed through measures addressing labor conditions, including factory inspection reforms and legislation limiting the hours that could be required of certain categories of workers, that put him repeatedly at odds with the very party bosses who had helped elect him. He instituted a franchise tax on corporations that used public resources, particularly utility and transit companies operating under public franchises, a modest measure by later standards, but one that provoked considerable resistance from business interests accustomed to operating with minimal state oversight and from the party leaders who depended on the financial support of those same business interests. Roosevelt maintained a practice, unusual for a governor operating within a strong party machine, of meeting personally and directly with reformers, journalists, and policy experts outside the party structure to inform his decisions, a habit that Platt found alternately useful when it produced political benefits for the party and infuriating when it produced policy outcomes the machine had not sanctioned. And he insisted on a level of independence in appointments and policy that Platt and his allies found increasingly difficult to manage. This growing friction between Roosevelt and the New York Republican machine created, by 1900, a genuine political problem for Platt and his associates, who found themselves governing alongside a popular but unpredictable figure they could neither easily control nor safely discard given his public standing. It was in this context that the idea emerged, promoted with considerable enthusiasm by Platt and other party leaders eager to remove Roosevelt from a position where he could continue to complicate their management of state affairs, that Roosevelt should be nominated for the vice presidency alongside President William McKinley in the election of 1900. The vice presidency of that era was widely regarded as a position of minimal actual power, a ceremonial post that had swallowed the ambitions of more than one promising political career, and Platt's calculation was straightforward. Elevate Roosevelt to a position of apparent honor while removing him from the more consequential arena of state governance, where his reforms continued to unsettle established interests. Roosevelt himself was initially reluctant, aware of the vice presidency's reputation as a political dead end and uncertain whether the move served his own ambitions, which by this point extended well beyond the governorship of a single state. He was eventually persuaded, in part by the sheer momentum of party sentiment at the Republican convention in Philadelphia, where delegates enthusiastic about his war record and reformist reputation nominated him for the vice presidency with an energy that made refusal politically awkward, and in part by his own calculation that national prominence, even in a largely ceremonial office, might serve him better in the long run than continued friction with the New York machine. The campaign of 1900 pitted McKinley and Roosevelt against the same Democratic challenger who had lost to McKinley 4 years earlier, William Jennings Bryan, and Roosevelt, characteristically, threw himself into the campaign with an energy that exceeded what was typically expected of vice presidential candidates, traveling extensively and delivering speeches across the country with the same vigor he brought to every undertaking. McKinley and Roosevelt won a decisive victory, and in March of 1901, Roosevelt was inaugurated as Vice President of the United States, a position that offered him considerably less to do than he was accustomed to, and one that he privately regarded with a certain restlessness even as he settled, for the moment, into its largely ceremonial rhythms. The relationship between Roosevelt and McKinley during this brief period was cordial and respectful, though never especially close in a personal sense. McKinley was a more cautious, more traditionally conservative figure than Roosevelt in both temperament and policy, a president who had guided the country through the war with Spain and its complicated aftermath, including the acquisition of the Philippines and the difficult, often brutal counterinsurgency that followed in that archipelago, and who represented in many ways an older style of Republican leadership more attentive to the interests of established business and party structures than Roosevelt's instincts would ultimately prove to be. Roosevelt, for his part, understood the practical necessity of deference to a sitting president and largely avoided public friction with McKinley during his brief vice presidency, even as private correspondence and the observations of those around him suggested a man who found the largely ornamental duties of the office considerably less satisfying than the more consequential work he had done as governor. The political atmosphere of the United States at the turn of the 20th century was one of significant transformation. Industrial capitalism had produced enormous concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of corporate trusts controlling steel, oil, railroads, and other essential sectors of the economy. Even as labor unrest, immigration, urbanization, and the visible suffering of workers in unsafe and poorly compensated jobs generated a growing public appetite for reform. This was the environment, restless and increasingly reform-minded, into which Roosevelt would be thrust with shocking suddenness in September of 1901, when President McKinley, attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, was shot by an anarchist named Leon Zalgas during a public reception. McKinley initially seemed likely to survive the wound, and Roosevelt, informed of the shooting while traveling, rushed to Buffalo before eventually being persuaded that the president's condition had stabilized sufficiently that he could resume a planned vacation with his family in the Adirondack Mountains. It was there, in a remote mountain camp accessible only by a demanding hike, that Roosevelt received the news, carried by messengers who climbed through the night, that McKinley's condition had suddenly and gravely worsened. Roosevelt's journey from the Adirondacks back to Buffalo has become one of the more dramatic footnotes of American political history, a race through mountain darkness by carriage and then by special train, undertaken by a man who understood, even as he traveled, that he might well be journeying toward the presidency of the United States. McKinley died in the early morning hours of September 14th, and Roosevelt, arriving in Buffalo shortly afterward, was sworn in as president that same day in a private ceremony, becoming, at 42 years of age, the youngest man ever to hold the office, a distinction he retains to this day, though it should be noted that John F. Kennedy remains the youngest man ever elected to the presidency in his own right, a distinction separate from Roosevelt's record as the youngest to actually hold the office. The public reaction to this sudden transfer of power was a complicated mixture of grief for the assassinated president and considerable uncertainty about what kind of leader his young, energetic, and famously unpredictable successor would prove to be. Conservative Republicans, including Mark Hanna, the influential party strategist who had been instrumental in McKinley's political rise, viewed Roosevelt's ascension with open alarm, reportedly remarking, in a comment that circulated widely and has been recorded in various forms by different sources, that the country now had that damned cowboy in the White House, a sentiment that captured the anxiety of an established political class uncertain whether the reformist energy Roosevelt had, displayed as governor of New York, would now be unleashed on the national stage. Roosevelt moved carefully in his early months as president, retaining McKinley's cabinet and publicly emphasizing continuity in order to reassure a nation still processing the shock of assassination and to calm the fears of a business community anxious about what an unrestrained reformer might attempt from the highest office in the land. But this caution proved temporary, and over the course of his presidency, Roosevelt would articulate and pursue a program of reform that came to be known as the Square Deal, a phrase capturing his belief that government had a legitimate role in ensuring fair treatment for ordinary Americans against the concentrated power of corporate trusts, while still respecting the fundamental structures of American capitalism rather than seeking to overturn them. Trust busting became one of the signature elements of this program, though Roosevelt's actual approach was considerably more nuanced than the simple label suggests. He distinguished, in his own thinking and public rhetoric, between what he termed good trusts, large corporate combinations that operated efficiently and treated workers and consumers fairly, and bad trusts, which used their market power to exploit the public, crush competition through illegitimate means, and evade any meaningful accountability. His administration's prosecution of the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company that Roosevelt's Justice Department targeted under the Sherman Antitrust Act, resulted in a Supreme Court decision in 1904 that upheld the government's authority to break up the combination, a landmark victory that established Roosevelt's reputation as a president willing to challenge corporate power directly, even as he pursued dozens of other antitrust actions throughout his time in office with a selectivity that reflected his belief in regulation and accountability rather than a blanket hostility to large-scale enterprise itself. Roosevelt's approach to labor relations reflected a similar philosophy of balanced intervention rather than reflexive alignment with either capital or labor. When a major coal strike in 1902 threatened to leave much of the northeastern United States without adequate heating fuel as winter approached, Roosevelt took the unprecedented step of inviting representatives of both the mine owners and the striking United Mine Workers to the White House for direct negotiations. And when the mine owners proved recalcitrant, he threatened to use federal troops to operate the mines directly, a threat that helped push the parties toward an arbitrated settlement. This intervention marked a significant departure from the more common presidential pattern of the era, in which federal power had frequently been deployed on behalf of management against striking workers. And it reflected Roosevelt's broader conviction that the federal government held a legitimate responsibility to act as an honest broker between competing economic interests rather than simply defending the prerogatives of property. Consumer protection formed another substantial pillar of Roosevelt's domestic program, driven in considerable part by public revelations about the unsanitary and often dangerous conditions in American food processing industries. The publication of Upton Sinclair's novel about the Chicago meatpacking industry generated a wave of public outrage that Roosevelt, after commissioning his own independent investigation to verify the troubling conditions described, used to press for legislative reform. The resulting Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act, both passed in 1906, established federal oversight of food and pharmaceutical production and represented a significant expansion of the regulatory authority of the national government. Grounded in Roosevelt's conviction that industries affecting public health and safety could not be left entirely to the self-regulation of the businesses profiting from them. Roosevelt's governing philosophy throughout these years rested on a set of convictions that he articulated repeatedly in speeches and writings: that the federal government possessed a legitimate and indeed necessary role in checking concentrations of economic power that threatened the fairness of American life, that the presidency itself should be an active, engaged office rather than a passive administrator of existing law, and that American democracy required a citizenry and a leadership class willing to embrace what he called the strenuous life, a philosophy of vigorous engagement with the world that he had articulated in a famous speech years before his presidency, and that continued to shape his understanding of both personal character and national purpose throughout his time in office. His cabinet during these years included figures of considerable talent and, in several cases, considerable independence of mind, including Secretary of State John Hay, who had served presidents since Lincoln and brought a wealth of diplomatic experience to Roosevelt's foreign policy initiatives, and Secretary of War Elihu Root, whose administrative skill helped Roosevelt manage the complicated colonial responsibilities the United States had acquired in the aftermath of the Spanish War. Roosevelt's daily routine as president reflected the same energetic habits that had characterized his entire adult life. He rose early, worked through a demanding schedule of meetings and correspondence, and made time, often to the visible exhaustion of aides and visitors half his age, for vigorous physical exercise, including long hikes through Rock Creek Park in Washington that sometimes involved fording the creek directly rather than detouring around it, boxing matches that continued until an injury to one eye, sustained during a White House bout, eventually left him partially blind in that eye later in life. Tennis, horseback riding, and swimming, all pursued with the same intensity he brought to his political work. His family life at the White House became, during these years, a subject of considerable public fascination, in part because Roosevelt's 6 children, ranging in age from young adulthood down to early childhood during his presidency, brought an energy and informality to the executive mansion that captured the public imagination. His second wife, Edith Kermit Caro Roosevelt, whom he had married some years after the tragic early death of his first wife, managed the White House household with a combination of grace and firm practicality that provided a stabilizing counterweight to her husband's more exuberant temperament. And she exercised a degree of quiet influence over Roosevelt's personal and even political judgment that historians have increasingly recognized in recent decades, even though she generally avoided public political statements consistent with the norms of the era. The Roosevelt children, meanwhile, turned the White House grounds into something resembling an adventure playground, keeping an extraordinary menagerie of pets that included a badger, a one-legged rooster, several dogs, a small bear, and a pony that was once reportedly brought into the White House elevator to visit a sick sibling. Incidents that delighted the press and contributed to a public sense of the Roosevelt White House as a place of unusual vitality compared to the more staid households of previous administrations. Roosevelt's own relationship with his children reflected the same philosophy of vigorous engagement that shaped his public life. He organized what the family came to call point-to-point walks through Rock Creek Park, rambling expeditions that proceeded in as straight a line as possible regardless of the obstacles encountered, whether that meant climbing directly over rock faces, wading through the creek itself in formal clothing, or scaling the walls of the French embassy on one occasion when it happened to lie along the chosen path. Visiting dignitaries and foreign ambassadors, invited to join these excursions, sometimes found themselves considerably more winded and considerably more mud-spattered than diplomatic protocol might normally have anticipated, and Roosevelt appeared to take a particular delight in testing the physical mettle of guests who arrived expecting a more sedate presidential pastime. His enthusiasm for boxing continued into the White House itself, where he sparred regularly with military aides and once suffered a detached retina in his left eye during a bout, an injury he kept largely private, and that gradually cost him the sight in that eye over the following years, a consequence he treated with the same stoic dismissal he applied to most physical setbacks in his life. This relentless physical vigor was, for Roosevelt, never merely recreational, but an expression of a broader philosophy he had articulated years earlier in a speech titled The Strenuous Life, delivered before he became president, in which he argued that both individuals and nations were strengthened through difficulty, risk, and sustained effort, and weakened by comfort, ease, and the avoidance of hardship. This conviction, rooted in his own transformation from a frail, asthmatic child into a figure of famous physical vitality through years of deliberate exercise, shaped his approach to nearly everything, from his insistence on personally testing new military equipment to his belief that a nation's character depended on the willingness of its citizens, and especially its young men, to embrace challenge rather than retreat into what he regarded as a dangerously soft and overly comfortable modern existence. Critics, then and since, have noted the ways this philosophy shaded into a celebration of martial vigor and a certain impatience with those, whether individuals or nations, that Roosevelt regarded as insufficiently strenuous, a strand of his thinking that connects in uncomfortable ways to his enthusiasm for American expansion abroad. Conservation emerged as perhaps the most enduring element of Roosevelt's domestic legacy, reflecting both his personal passion for the natural world, cultivated since childhood through his early interest in natural history, and later deepened through his experiences ranching and hunting in the American West, and his conviction that the nation's natural resources required active, scientific management to prevent their exhaustion by short-term commercial exploitation. Working closely with Gifford Pinchot, the trained forester who headed the Forest Service and became one of Roosevelt's closest advisors on conservation policy, Roosevelt oversaw a dramatic expansion of federally protected land, establishing dozens of national forests, 5 national parks, and, through his use of the Antiquities Act passed in 1906, a series of national monuments that protected sites of particular natural or historical significance, including the Grand Canyon, which Roosevelt protected as a national monument after Congress proved unwilling to grant it full national park status during his presidency, a designation it would not receive until years after he left office. Roosevelt's conservation philosophy, shaped substantially by his collaboration with Pinchot, emphasized what came to be called conservationism, a philosophy of managed, sustainable use of natural resources for the long-term benefit of the nation, as distinguished from the preservationist philosophy associated with the naturalist John Muir, who advocated for the protection of wilderness in a more absolute sense, largely free from commercial exploitation of any kind. This distinction, sometimes subtle in practice but significant in principle, generated real tension within the conservation movement of the era and Roosevelt's own sympathies, while genuinely inclined toward the preservationist appreciation of wild nature that he shared with Muir, whom he accompanied on a celebrated camping trip through Yosemite in 1903, were ultimately shaped by his pragmatic political conviction that conservation policy needed to accommodate the legitimate economic interests of a growing nation in order to be politically sustainable, a position that placed him, in practice, closer to Pinchot's managed use philosophy than to Muir's more uncompromising preservationism, even as he retained throughout his life a personal reverence for wilderness that went beyond mere utilitarian calculation. The trip to Yosemite with Muir, during which the two men reportedly spent several nights camping without the elaborate accommodations that a presidential visit might normally have entailed, waking at one point to find themselves dusted with a light snowfall, became one of the most celebrated episodes of Roosevelt's engagement with the conservation movement. And Muir used the opportunity to press Roosevelt on the importance of protecting Yosemite Valley itself, which at the time remained under California state rather than federal control, a matter Roosevelt would later help resolve in favor of federal protection. The tension between Muir's preservationist instincts and Pinchot's more utilitarian conservationism would resurface with considerable bitterness after Roosevelt left office, most notably in the prolonged national controversy over the proposed damming of the Hetch Hetchy Valley within Yosemite National Park to supply water to the city of San Francisco, a dispute Muir regarded as an existential betrayal of the preservationist cause and Pinchot supported as a legitimate use of natural resources for the public good. Roosevelt himself, though no longer in office when the Hetch Hetchy fight reached its climax, had generally sided with the practical, resource management approach associated with Pinchot throughout his presidency. Even while his personal correspondence and his evident emotional response to wilderness itself suggested a man whose private sympathies ran closer to Muir's reverence for nature left largely undisturbed by human development. This underlying tension between conservation understood as the wise, scientific management of resources for sustained human use and preservation understood as the protection of wild nature from development regardless of its potential utility, would remain a defining fault line within the American environmental movement long after Roosevelt's presidency ended. And Roosevelt's own legacy sits somewhat uneasily astride that divide, claimed by both traditions even though his actual policy choices, shaped heavily by his partnership with Pinchot at the Forest Service, tilted more consistently toward managed use than toward strict preservation. What both men agreed upon, and what Roosevelt championed with real personal conviction throughout his presidency, was the fundamental principle that the nation's forests, water sources, and wildlands were a common inheritance requiring active federal stewardship rather than unregulated private exploitation, a principle that represented a genuine transformation in American governance and that endures, in modified form, in the federal land management agencies that continue to oversee national forests, parks, and refuges today. The broader legacy of Roosevelt's conservation policies, encompassing roughly 230 million acres of public land brought under some form of federal protection during his presidency, represents one of the most consequential and least politically contested achievements of his time in office, a legacy that continues to shape the American landscape and the structure of federal land management more than a century later. Foreign policy occupied a central place in Roosevelt's presidency, guided by a philosophy he summarized in the phrase "speak softly and carry a big stick," a formulation capturing his belief that American diplomacy should be conducted with restraint and careful language, but backed always by credible military strength that gave that diplomacy real weight. This philosophy found its most consequential expression in Roosevelt's pursuit of an American-controlled canal across the Isthmus of Panama, a project of enormous strategic and commercial significance that would allow naval and commercial vessels to move between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without the lengthy and dangerous voyage around the southern tip of South America. The territory through which the canal would pass was, at the time negotiations began, a province of Colombia, and when the Colombian Senate rejected a treaty that would have granted the United States rights to build the canal, Roosevelt's administration responded with actions that remain among the more controversial episodes of his foreign policy. A Panamanian independence movement, which had existed for some time independent of American involvement, but which found the moment and the implicit support of American naval power convenient for its purposes, declared Panama's separation from Colombia in November of 1903, and the United States moved quickly to recognize the new nation and to conclude a treaty granting American control over a canal zone, with American naval vessels positioned nearby in a manner that effectively prevented Colombian forces from suppressing the rebellion. Roosevelt's own later characterization of these events, in which he suggested with characteristic bluntness that he had essentially taken the Canal Zone, generated controversy both at the time and in subsequent historical assessment, with critics arguing that the episode represented an act of American imperial overreach conducted at the expense of Colombian sovereignty, while defenders, including Roosevelt himself, maintained that the strategic and commercial benefits of the canal justified the administration's actions and that the Panamanian independence movement possessed genuine indigenous support independent of American manipulation. The construction of the canal itself, undertaken over the following decade, represented one of the most significant engineering achievements of the era, requiring American engineers and administrators to solve problems of tropical disease control, most critically the mosquito-borne diseases that had doomed an earlier French attempt to build the canal under Ferdinand de Lesseps. Alongside extraordinary challenges of excavation and lock construction across difficult terrain, including the massive undertaking of cutting through the Culebra Cut, where repeated landslides plagued engineers throughout the project and required years of persistent, costly remediation. The successful application of the mosquito control insights developed by Walter Reed and applied on a massive scale by William Gorgas, who oversaw an extensive program of sanitation, drainage, and mosquito eradication across the canal zone, transformed the health conditions for canal workers, and stands as one of the notable public health achievements associated with the broader canal project, dramatically reducing the death toll that had made the earlier French effort so catastrophic. Even so, the human cost of the American construction phase, borne disproportionately by Caribbean laborers, particularly workers recruited from Barbados and other West Indian islands who performed much of the most physically dangerous excavation work under a racially stratified pay and treatment system that afforded far better wages and living conditions to white American employees than to black Caribbean workers, remains an important and often underemphasized part of the fuller historical account of the canal's building, one that later historians have worked to bring into fuller view alongside the more celebratory engineering narrative that dominated contemporary American coverage of the project. Roosevelt visited the canal construction site personally in 1906, becoming the first sitting American president to travel outside the continental United States while in office, a trip that generated its own considerable public attention and that allowed Roosevelt, ever eager for direct physical engagement with the projects he championed, to inspect the excavation work firsthand, reportedly operating a steam shovel himself in a widely photographed moment that came to symbolize the hands-on, personally invested style of leadership Roosevelt brought to the canal project throughout its development. Even though the canal would not be completed and open to shipping until 1914, 5 years after he left the presidency, Roosevelt's broader approach to Latin America found further expression in what came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, articulated in 1904 in response to concerns about European powers using debt collection as a pretext for military intervention in Latin American nations, most immediately the Dominican Republic. The corollary asserted that the United States itself would act as a kind of hemispheric policeman, intervening when necessary in the internal affairs of Latin American nations to preempt the kind of instability that might invite European intervention, a policy that in practice justified a series of American interventions in the Caribbean and Central America over subsequent decades, and that critics, then and since, have identified as a significant expansion of American imperial ambition in the hemisphere, one that subordinated the sovereignty of smaller nations to the strategic and commercial interests of the United States, even while framed in the language of protecting hemispheric stability from European encroachment. Roosevelt's conviction that American power required visible demonstration found perhaps its most dramatic expression in his decision to send the Great White Fleet, a squadron of 16 battleships painted in gleaming white peacetime livery, on a voyage around the world beginning in December of 1907. The fleet's circumnavigation, which included port visits across multiple continents and drew enormous public attention both in the United States and abroad, served Roosevelt's purpose of demonstrating that the United States had become a naval power of the first rank, a message directed with particular deliberateness toward Japan, whose own naval ambitions in the Pacific had grown considerably following its stunning victory over Russia in the War of 1904 and 1905. The voyage represented a striking assertion of American global reach at a moment when the nation's identity as an emerging world power was still being defined, both by Americans themselves and by the other nations observing this new entrant onto the stage of international great power politics. Roosevelt's most celebrated diplomatic achievement came in his mediation of the Russo-Japanese War, a conflict that had exposed the military weakness of Russia and confirmed Japan's emergence as a formidable modern power, but that had also exhausted both combatants sufficiently that each proved receptive to American mediation efforts. Roosevelt convened peace negotiations at the Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905, engaging personally and at considerable length with the Russian and Japanese delegations in an effort to bridge the gap between their positions, particularly regarding the question of financial indemnity and territorial concessions on the island of Sakhalin. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth ended the war on terms that, while generating some domestic frustration in Japan over the absence of an indemnity payment, successfully concluded a conflict that had threatened to destabilize the balance of power in East Asia, and Roosevelt's role in brokering the settlement earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, making him the first American to receive that honor, a recognition of the personal diplomatic skill and sustained attention he brought to a negotiation that many observers had doubted could succeed. Having won a full term in his own right in the election of 1904, Roosevelt made a decision, announced on the very night of that election victory, that he would not seek another term in 1908, a pledge rooted in his respect for the two-term tradition established by George Washington, even though the Constitution at that time imposed no formal limit on presidential terms. This decision, which Roosevelt would come to regret in later years as his relationship with his chosen successor deteriorated, reflected his conviction, sincerely held at the time, even if later reconsidered, that a president who served more than 2 terms risked accumulating a dangerous concentration of personal power inconsistent with Republican principles. Roosevelt used his influence to secure the Republican nomination in 1908 for William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, and a man Roosevelt believed shared his own progressive instincts and would continue the policies of the Square Deal in a manner faithful to Roosevelt's own vision. Taft won the presidency comfortably, and Roosevelt, having handed off the office to a chosen successor, embarked on an extended African safari beginning in 1909, an expedition combining big-game hunting with serious scientific collection undertaken in cooperation with the Smithsonian Institution, which received thousands of specimens gathered during the year-long journey across British East Africa and the Nile watershed. The safari, followed by an extensive European tour, during which Roosevelt met with numerous heads of state and delivered a series of significant public lectures, including a notable address in France on civic responsibility, allowed Roosevelt to remain a figure of considerable international prominence even while formally out of office. It was during this period abroad, and increasingly upon his return to the United States in 1910, that Roosevelt's confidence in Taft began to erode, as reports reached him suggesting that Taft's administration, whether through genuine philosophical difference or simple political miscalculation, was governing in a manner considerably more conservative and considerably more accommodating to the established Republican Party structure than Roosevelt had anticipated or desired. Disputes over tariff policy, over conservation matters including a controversial dispute involving Gifford Pinchot's dismissal from the Forest Service, and over the general direction of Republican governance widened the breach between the two men. And by 1912, Roosevelt had concluded that he could not in good conscience remain on the sidelines while what he regarded as the progressive legacy of his own presidency was, in his view, being dismantled or neglected under Taft's leadership. Roosevelt's decision to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912 split the party in a manner that proved politically catastrophic for Republican prospects that year, even as it produced one of the most dramatic political episodes in American history. When the Republican convention, controlled by party regulars loyal to Taft, denied Roosevelt the nomination despite his strong showing in the relatively new mechanism of state primary elections, Roosevelt and his supporters bolted the party entirely, forming the Progressive Party, which quickly became known by its more memorable popular nickname, the Bull Moose Party, drawn from Roosevelt's own declaration that he felt fit as a bull moose upon accepting the new party's nomination. The resulting three-way contest between Taft, Roosevelt, and the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson split the Republican vote so thoroughly that Wilson won the presidency with a plurality of the popular vote, while Roosevelt actually outperformed the sitting Republican President Taft. An unprecedented result in American electoral history that underscored both Roosevelt's continuing personal popularity and the depth of the rupture within his former party. It was during this extraordinary campaign that Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt that has become one of the most remarkable episodes of his entire public life. On the evening of October 14, 1912, as Roosevelt was preparing to deliver a campaign speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a man named John Schrank stepped from a crowd and fired a revolver directly at Roosevelt's chest at close range. The bullet struck Roosevelt, but was slowed significantly by the folded 50-page speech manuscript in his breast pocket alongside a metal eyeglass case, both of which absorbed much of the bullet's force before it penetrated his chest, lodging in muscle tissue without reaching his lung. Roosevelt, drawing on the same physical toughness and sense of dramatic occasion that had characterized his entire public career, recognized that he was not coughing blood and concluded, correctly as it turned out, that the wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, and he made the extraordinary decision to proceed with his scheduled speech rather than seek immediate medical attention, telling the assembled crowd that he had just been shot, but that it would take more than that to kill a bull moose, before delivering a lengthy address, visibly bloodied, that lasted approximately 90 minutes before he finally consented to be taken to a hospital. The bullet remained lodged in Roosevelt's chest for the remainder of his life, as physicians determined that the risks of attempting its removal outweighed the relatively modest dangers of leaving it in place. And the episode, remarkable both for the survival itself and for Roosevelt's characteristic determination to complete his planned task despite his injury, added yet another layer to the legend of physical toughness that had accompanied Roosevelt since his days in Cuba, even as it briefly paused a campaign that would ultimately end in defeat for both Roosevelt and Taft at Wilson's hands that November. In the aftermath of his defeat in 1912, and evidently seeking the kind of demanding physical and intellectual challenge that had always restored his spirits during difficult periods, Roosevelt undertook what would become one of the most perilous expeditions of his life, a journey into the Brazilian Amazon in 1913 and 1914 to explore and map an uncharted tributary known, evocatively, as the River of Doubt. The expedition, organized in partnership with the Brazilian explorer Candido Rondon, a man of considerable skill and experience in Amazonian exploration, was intended initially as a natural history collecting expedition in the tradition of Roosevelt's earlier African safari, but it evolved, once the decision was made to navigate the unexplored river itself, into a genuine survival ordeal that nearly cost Roosevelt his life and permanently damaged his health. The expedition faced a cascading series of catastrophes almost from the moment it committed to descending the unmapped river. The party's canoes were poorly suited to the violent rapids and waterfalls that punctuated the river's course, and repeated capsizes destroyed critical supplies and equipment while claiming the life of one expedition member who drowned attempting to navigate a particularly dangerous stretch of rapids. Food supplies dwindled far more quickly than anticipated, forcing the party into a state of genuine and dangerous hunger as they struggled to hunt and forage in unfamiliar and often unforgiving terrain, and disease, in the form of tropical fevers that struck multiple members of the expedition, further weakened a group already exhausted by the physical demands of portaging canoes and supplies around unnavigable stretches of white water. Roosevelt himself, already 55 years old and carrying the accumulated physical toll of decades of strenuous activity, along with the lingering effects of the assassination attempt bullets still lodged in his chest, suffered a severe leg infection following a minor injury sustained while attempting to help free one of the expedition's canoes from a rock in the current, compounded by a recurrence of the malaria he had first contracted years earlier. At the low point of the expedition, his condition deteriorated so severely, with raging fever and delirium, that he reportedly urged his companions, including his own son Kermit who accompanied him on the journey, to leave him behind rather than allow his condition to endanger the survival of the entire party, and offer his companions, and Kermit in particular, absolutely refused. even as Roosevelt's fever climbed and his weight fell alarmingly over the following weeks. The physical environment through which the expedition moved offered little opportunity for recovery. The unmapped river cut through dense, largely unbroken rainforest inhabited by indigenous peoples who had had little or no prior contact with outsiders, and the expedition's presence, however scientifically motivated, represented an intrusion into territory whose human geography was as unknown to Roosevelt's party as its physical geography. The rapids that repeatedly threatened the expedition's canoes forced exhausting portages through thick jungle, during which supplies were carried on the backs of already weakened men, and the accumulated toll of insect-borne illness, inadequate nutrition, and unrelenting physical exertion left the party, by the expedition's later stages, reduced to a fraction of its original strength and provisions. Roosevelt's own physician on the expedition grew seriously concerned that the former president might die in the jungle, a possibility that Roosevelt himself, in his more lucid moments, appears to have contemplated with the same unflinching directness he brought to other confrontations with mortality throughout his life. Roosevelt survived, though he emerged from the Amazon having lost a significant portion of his body weight and carrying health damage, including the effects of the recurring malaria and a permanently weakened physical constitution, from which he would never fully recover for the remainder of his life. Historians have consistently regarded the River of Doubt expedition, later renamed in Roosevelt's honor as the Rio Roosevelt, as one of the most genuinely dangerous undertakings ever attempted by a former American president, a journey that succeeded in its scientific and geographic purpose of mapping a previously uncharted river of considerable length, contributing genuine new information to the geographic understanding of the Amazon basin. But that came at a cost to Roosevelt's health, from which the historical record makes clear he never fully recovered, a debt his body would continue to pay in the diminished years that remained to him. The final years of Roosevelt's life were shaped substantially by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and by his increasingly forceful criticism of President Woodrow Wilson's policy of American neutrality in the conflict's early years. Roosevelt, whose entire worldview was built around convictions of national strength, military preparedness, and moral clarity in the face of aggression, viewed Wilson's cautious neutrality as a form of weakness, and he campaigned publicly and vigorously for American military preparedness and eventual entry into the war on the side of the Allied powers, a position that placed him at odds with a significant portion of American public opinion in the war's early years, but that aligned with sentiment that shifted considerably as the conflict progressed and as German actions, including submarine warfare against neutral shipping, gradually eroded American patience for neutrality. When the United States finally entered the war in 1917, Roosevelt, despite his advancing age and the accumulated toll on his health from his African and Amazonian expeditions and from the assassination attempt years before, petitioned President Wilson for permission to raise and personally lead a volunteer division to fight in France, an echo of his own Rough Rider experience nearly 2 decades earlier. Wilson, for reasons both personal and strategic, declined this request, a rejection that Roosevelt felt keenly as a denial of the kind of direct, personal service to the nation that had always defined his understanding of honorable citizenship. Instead, Roosevelt watched from home as his own sons served in the conflict, all 4 of his boys eventually seeing action in various capacities, a fact that brought him considerable paternal pride even as it exposed his family to the genuine dangers of modern industrial warfare. The heaviest blow of these final years fell in July of 1918, when Roosevelt's youngest son, Quentin, a fighter pilot serving with American forces in France, was shot down and killed in aerial combat over enemy lines. The loss of Quentin devastated Roosevelt in a manner that friends and family observed with considerable concern, a grief compounded by the particular circumstances of a father who had, in some sense, instilled in his sons the very values of courage and willingness to serve that had led directly to this loss. Roosevelt bore his grief with the public stoicism expected of a man of his generation and public stature, but those closest to him recorded a marked decline in his vitality and evident happiness following Quentin's death, even as he continued to write and to comment publicly on the political issues of the day with undiminished intellectual vigor. Roosevelt's health, already compromised by the cumulative effects of the Amazon expedition, recurring malaria, the lodged bullet from the 1912 assassination attempt, and the general physical toll of a lifetime of strenuous activity, declined steadily through 1918, and he spent periods of that final year hospitalized with various ailments, including severe attacks of inflammatory rheumatism and continuing complications from his tropical illnesses. He continued to write prolifically even as his physical condition worsened, producing articles and commentary on the war and on domestic politics that reflected a mind that remained sharp and engaged even as his body failed him. And there remained, until nearly the very end, considerable political speculation that Roosevelt might seek and win the Republican presidential nomination again in 1920, a testament to his continuing public standing despite the personal and physical difficulties of his final years. Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at his home at Sagamore Hill on Long Island in the early morning hours of January 6, 1919, at the age of 60, the apparent cause of blood clot that traveled to his lungs. The news of his death, though he had been visibly unwell for some time, still struck the nation with considerable force, and tributes poured in from across the political spectrum, including from Vice President Thomas Marshall, who is reported to have remarked that death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake there would have been a fight, a comment that captured something essential about how Americans of his era understood the ferocious vitality that had defined Roosevelt's entire public life. Assessing Theodore Roosevelt's legacy requires holding in mind, simultaneously, an unusually wide range of achievements and an equally significant set of criticisms that historians have continued to examine with growing attention in recent decades. His domestic reforms, encompassing trust regulation, consumer protection, labor mediation, and above all his transformative conservation program, established patterns of federal regulatory engagement with the economy and federal stewardship of natural resources that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the American government in both the marketplace and the natural landscape. Patterns that later reform movements, including the New Deal decades later, would build upon and extend. His foreign policy, encompassing the acquisition of the Panama Canal Zone, the assertive Roosevelt Corollary, and the demonstration of American naval power through the voyage of the Great White Fleet, established the United States decisively as a global power with interests and influence extending well beyond the Western Hemisphere, even as the methods by which this power was asserted, particularly in Panama and across the broader Caribbean basin, raised serious and legitimate questions about American respect for the sovereignty of smaller nations that historians continue to debate. Roosevelt's record on matters of race, viewed through the lens of contemporary historical scholarship, presents a genuinely complicated picture that resists simple characterization in either direction. He took the unprecedented step of inviting Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House in 1901, an act that generated intense backlash from white Southerners and that represented, at the time, a significant symbolic gesture toward racial inclusion at the highest level of American public life. Yet his broader record included policies and statements, including his handling of the Brownsville affair in which he summarily discharged without honor an entire regiment of black soldiers based on disputed and ultimately discredited accusations that reflected the racial attitudes and hierarchies common among white Americans of his era, attitudes that fall well short of contemporary standards of racial justice, and that historians have increasingly scrutinized as part of a fuller and more honest accounting of his presidency. His enthusiasm for American expansion and for what he viewed as the civilizing mission of Anglo-American institutions, expressed at various points in language that reflected the racial and civilizational hierarchies common to imperial thinking of his era, has similarly drawn increasing critical attention from historians examining the human costs of American expansion in the Philippines, in Panama, and across the broader sphere of American influence in the Caribbean and Central America that Roosevelt's policies helped to establish and extend. These criticisms do not erase the genuine accomplishments of his domestic reform agenda or the sincerity of his conservationist convictions, but they form an essential part of any balanced historical assessment of a man whose worldview was shaped, like that of virtually all his contemporaries, by assumptions about race, civilization, and national destiny that later generations have come to view with considerable more skepticism and moral discomfort. Roosevelt's influence on the American presidency itself proved substantial and lasting, as he helped establish the modern conception of the office as an active, publicly engaged center of national leadership rather than a more passive administrator of existing law, a model that subsequent presidents across the political spectrum, including his distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would draw upon and expand in their own approaches to executive leadership. His personal example of a man who overcame significant childhood physical frailty through relentless self-discipline, who pursued an extraordinarily wide range of intellectual and physical accomplishments across natural history, military service, elected office, and literary production, and who articulated throughout his life a philosophy of vigorous, engaged citizenship that he termed the strenuous life, has continued to shape American conceptions of public leadership and personal character. Well beyond his own political achievements, what remains, in the end, when the full record is weighed together, is a figure of genuine and lasting historical consequence, whose energy touched nearly every dimension of American public life during a period of profound national transformation, and whose legacy continues to generate serious and legitimate debate precisely because his accomplishments and his failings were both so considerable. He was a man who transformed himself through sheer discipline from a sickly, asthmatic child into one of the most physically vigorous public figures of his age, who found in the crucible of combat in Cuba both personal validation and the platform from which his political ascent accelerated dramatically, who used the power of the presidency to reshape the relationship between American government and both the economic marketplace and the natural landscape, and who asserted American power on the world stage in ways that expanded the nation's global influence while also extending, in less admirable ways, patterns of intervention and disregard for the sovereignty of weaker nations that would echo through American foreign policy for decades afterward. He was, throughout his life, a man in constant motion, seemingly incapable of rest, driven by an inner restlessness that carried him from the ranches of the Dakota Territory to the jungles of Cuba, from the governorship of New York to the presidency of the United States, from the plains of East Africa to the uncharted rapids of the Amazon, always seeking the next demanding challenge through which to test and prove himself. This restlessness produced genuine and lasting achievement in the conservation of vast American landscapes that remain protected today, in the establishment of regulatory principles that reshape the relationship between American government and American business, and in a model of vigorous, engaged public leadership that continues to influence how Americans think about the presidency itself. It also produced genuine harm in policies toward Latin America and toward the peoples of the Philippines that reflected an imperial confidence in American power untroubled by adequate consideration of the sovereignty and dignity of those subjected to it, and in racial attitudes that, however progressive by the narrow standards of his own era in certain respects, fell well short of anything resembling contemporary justice. It is worth pausing, in these final reflections, on the sheer improbability of the life that produced this legacy. Roosevelt began as a child so afflicted by asthma that his own father reportedly wondered whether he would survive to adulthood, a boy who could not climb a flight of stairs without pausing to catch his breath, and who transformed himself, through a program of exercise and exposure to hardship that he pursued with almost frightening deliberateness, into a man who boxed competitively at Harvard, ranched cattle through blizzards in the Dakota Badlands, led men up a fortified hill under direct rifle fire, and, well into his 50s, descended an unmapped Amazon tributary on foot and by canoe through some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. This transformation was not incidental to his public achievements, but foundational to them, since Roosevelt's entire understanding of leadership, of national character, and of the proper relationship between comfort and duty flowed directly from his conviction, tested first upon his own body, that human beings become stronger, wiser, and more capable through voluntary encounter with difficulty rather than through its avoidance. That conviction, the philosophy of the strenuous life, animated everything he did in public office, from his insistence that trusts be regulated rather than simply tolerated, to his conviction that wilderness needed active, engaged stewardship rather than passive neglect, to his belief that the United States itself needed to embrace a vigorous, assertive role on the world stage rather than retreat into what he regarded as a comfortable and cowardly isolation. It is a philosophy that has aged unevenly. Its emphasis on discipline, resilience, and the deliberate cultivation of strength through hardship continues to resonate with many Americans across the political spectrum, an inheritance visible in everything from modern conservation ethics to contemporary discussions of character and leadership. Its darker undercurrent, the conviction that strenuous, martial vigor represented not merely a personal virtue but a marker of civilizational worth that justified American dominance over peoples Roosevelt regarded as less developed, has aged far less well, and stands today as one of the clearest lines connecting his personal philosophy to the more troubling aspects of his foreign policy record. To understand Roosevelt fully requires holding both of these threads together without allowing either to cancel out the other. He was, unquestionably, one of the most consequential reformers ever to occupy the presidency, a man who used the office to challenge concentrated economic power on behalf of ordinary citizens at a moment when few of his predecessors had been willing to do so, and who left behind, in the national forests, parks, and monuments that still draw millions of visitors each year, a physical legacy of environmental stewardship that few American leaders before or since have matched in scale or vision. He was also a man whose confidence in American power and in his own judgment about how that power should be used led him to actions in Panama, in the Caribbean, and in his rhetorical support for American expansion in the Philippines that reflected a genuine indifference to the sovereignty and self-determination of peoples who did not share his nation's power. Actions that a fuller historical reckoning cannot simply set aside in favor of the more admirable elements of his record. Theodore Roosevelt remains, more than a century after his death, one of the most consistently ranked and consistently debated figures in the entire history of the American presidency, a man whose life resists easy summary precisely because it contains such a remarkable range of genuine accomplishment alongside genuine and serious moral failing. He believed, with an intensity that shaped every chapter of his public life, that character was built through struggle, that nations, like individuals, were tested and strengthened through difficulty rather than ease, and that public service represented the highest calling available to a person of ability and conscience. He carried that belief through a childhood of physical frailty overcome by will, through the sudden grief of losing both his mother and his first wife on the very same day in the same house early in his life, through the exhilaration and terror of combat in Cuba, through the sober responsibilities of the presidency, through the grief of losing a son to war, and finally through a body worn down by malaria, by a bullet he carried to his grave, and by the accumulated cost of a life lived by design at the outer edge of human endurance. Whatever else may be said of him, and a great deal has been said, in praise and in serious criticism alike, Theodore Roosevelt lived according to his own demanding philosophy with a consistency that few public figures in American history have matched, leaving behind a legacy of conservation, regulation, and engaged national leadership that continues to shape the country he served, alongside a record of imperial ambition and racial limitation that continues, rightly, to complicate any simple accounting of what his life and his presidency ultimately meant for the nation he led and for the wider world his decisions helped to shape. He remains, in the end, not a simple hero nor a simple villain, but something more difficult and more historically honest, an extraordinary, driven, and deeply human figure, whose triumphs and whose failures alike continue to shape the nation he loved with such evident and complicated intensity.